Part 3. The Destructive Labor Camps. Chapter 1. The Fingers of Aurora. Solzhenitsyn begins Part 3 with a warning about the limits of his evidence. To describe the labor camps fully would require the testimony of precisely those prisoners who experienced them most completely, and many of those people died. He therefore presents his account as a view through a peephole rather than from a tower. One does not need to drink an entire sea, he suggests, to know that it is salt. The chapter then pushes the origin of the camp system back to the first months of Bolshevik rule. Solzhenitsyn rejects the idea that concentration camps were a late Stalinist invention. In his account, the political logic of forced labor appeared almost immediately after the October Revolution, when the new government set about constructing its own army, police, courts, prisons, and instruments of coercion. He points to Lenin's early calls for severe discipline and to proposals combining imprisonment, confiscation, and forced labor. The important point for Solzhenitsyn is not that the mature Gulag existed in 1917 exactly as it would decades later, but that its governing principles were already visible. Political enemies could be isolated outside ordinary law, prisoners could be compelled to work, and confinement could be made economically useful to the state. The old prison buildings remained, but they were given what revolutionary language called a new class content. Even former czarist jailers could be retained if they were useful to the new regime. The early system was still administratively confused. Prisons and camps passed among different commissariats and security agencies. Old practices persisted, and prisoners in some places enjoyed forms of self-government that later generations would find unimaginable. Solzhenitsyn treats these remnants of relative informality almost as an evolutionary stage. They were not signs that the new state rejected coercion. Rather, the machinery had not yet discovered its most efficient form. The break with other socialist parties helped remove political obstacles to a more centralized punitive system, while the Civil War supplied the language of emergency through which extraordinary measures could become normal. The term concentration camp appeared openly in revolutionary decrees. Camps were established in monasteries and other enclosed complexes because they already possessed walls, buildings, and isolation. Political hostages, former officers, clergy, merchants, people labeled class enemies, and many others could be confined there. At the same time, forced labor was justified as both punishment and social transformation. In some early camps, prisoners still worked in town, mixed with civilians, received food from sympathetic residents, formed clubs, and even participated in performances. Solzhenitsyn emphasizes these details because they show what had not yet hardened. The authorities gradually learned that contact with ordinary society weakened control. The institutional structure consolidated as the security apparatus, accumulated prisons, convoy troops, registration systems, and service dogs under increasingly centralized authority. Names changed repeatedly, but the direction did not. By the early 1920s, the country already contained hundreds of places of confinement and tens of thousands of prisoners, with overcrowding worsening year by year. New categories such as corrective labor colonies and special isolators multiplied rather than replaced imprisonment. The system developed through bureaucratic experimentation, but its permanent principle was already clear. The state would maintain a population deprived of freedom and extract labor from it. Solzhenitsyn therefore presents the early camps as the first fingers of dawn, before the full sun of the archipelago rose. The system did not suddenly appear in 1937, and it cannot be explained simply as the personal creation of one later official. The legal, ideological, administrative, and economic foundations were laid much earlier. What later became Gulag grew from these beginnings through expansion and refinement. Solzhenitsyn supports this genealogy with the scattered numbers and administrative traces that survived. A provincial camp such as the early one at Ryazan could still look porous by later standards. Prisoners sometimes worked outside. Townspeople could bring food, and the institution had not yet sealed itself off completely from civic life. But the direction of policy was toward expansion and standardization. By 1920, official figures already listed 84 camps in 43 provinces, and in the following years, prisons, reformatories, colonies, isolators, and camps multiplied under overlapping agencies. Fingerprinting, convoy organization, centralized records, and guard units turned confinement into a bureaucratic profession. The organizational initials changed repeatedly, but Solzhenitsyn insists that later Gulag administration should be understood as the maturation of these early arrangements rather than as a separate invention. The new state learned, step by step, how to classify people, keep them isolated, transport them, and make their labor usable. Solzhenitsyn is especially interested in the ideological language surrounding these beginnings. Forced labor was presented not merely as a practical penalty, but as a method appropriate to class enemies and to the construction of a new social order. The state could therefore describe confinement, confiscation, and labor as parts of one revolutionary policy rather than as separate legal measures. Emergency terminology from civil war made it easier to treat broad groups according to social origin or presumed political danger instead of individually proven crimes. The importance of this language is that it made expansion morally intelligible to officials before the later economic machinery existed. A camp could be justified because the people inside belonged to categories the revolution had declared hostile. Once their labor also became useful, ideology and economics began to reinforce one another. The use of monasteries is emblematic. These complexes offered walls, dormitories, storerooms, workshops, and physical separation from towns. Reassigning them to prison purposes also expressed the attack on independent religious institutions. The physical inheritance of the old society could thus be converted into infrastructure for the new coercive state. Solzhenitsyn repeatedly notices this kind of continuity. Revolutionary power often proclaimed a complete historical break, while using buildings, personnel, administrative habits, and technologies inherited from what it condemned. Another continuity concerns the relationship between law and administration. The early camps did not always require the elaborate judicial forms later associated with political sentencing. Revolutionary bodies could isolate people through emergency powers, hostage policies, or broad social categories. This mattered because it trained officials to regard confinement as an administrative solution to political problems. Once a population could be moved outside ordinary legal protection, the practical questions became where to house it and what labor to extract, not whether each person had committed a conventionally provable offense. Chapter 2. The archipelago rises from the sea. The first great island of the developing archipelago is Solovki, the monastery complex in the White Sea. Solzhenitsyn begins with the natural beauty and long religious history of the islands. Monks had transformed an isolated northern landscape into an unusually productive settlement, with fisheries, livestock, gardens, workshops, canals, mills, power generation, and substantial stone buildings. The same geographical isolation and massive walls that had protected the monastery also made it attractive as a prison. The Russian state had confined selected political and religious offenders there before the revolution, but Solzhenitsyn argues against later Soviet attempts to portray the old monastery prison as a continuous torture institution, equivalent to what came afterward. After the Bolsheviks took power, the monastery was stripped of its old function. Monks were expelled except where their technical knowledge remained useful, property was seized, and the complex became the center of the northern special purpose camps. Solovki combined several characteristics that would later spread across the Gulag: remoteness, forced labor, political isolation, arbitrary punishment, a hierarchy of privileged prisoners, dependence on informers, and the exploitation of professional skills. Yet, in the 1920s, it still possessed a strange mixture of cruelty and improvisation. The future system was visible, but not all its rules had become fixed. Prisoners arrived from many categories: clergy and believers, former nobles and officers, members of defeated political parties, intellectuals, specialists, students, and ordinary offenders. The camp administration converted churches and monastic buildings into barracks. Solzhenitsyn contrasts the spiritual purpose for which the structures had been built with their new use as instruments of degradation. The natural environment remained magnificent, while the human order became increasingly merciless. Solovki developed a repertoire of punishment. The Sakirka punishment site became notorious for cold, hunger, isolation, humiliation, and executions. Guards and prisoner officials could exercise enormous discretionary power, yet the regime could also display irrational leniency or inconsistency. Solzhenitsyn recalls the case of Georgy Osorgin, who was scheduled for execution when his wife arrived to visit him. He was allowed several days with her on the condition that she not discover his fate. he maintained his composure throughout the visit and was shot after she departed. For Solzhenitsyn, the episode demonstrates both the prisoners' moral self-command and the incompletely standardized character of the early camp. Another peculiarity was that former white officers, because of their administrative and military experience, sometimes acquired important positions in the internal management of Solovki. They could even clash with the information and investigation section, which maintained networks of stool pigeons. At one point, prisoner administrators exposed informers and sent them away to remote worksites. Solzhenitsyn uses this bizarre struggle to show how the early archipelago still contained competing centers of authority that later Gulag would eliminate. The system, nevertheless, moved steadily toward its mature form. Naftali Frankel rose from prisoner to powerful organizer and became associated with the principle that a prisoner should be exploited intensely while his strength remained. Production increasingly dominated camp life. Food was poor, overcrowding severe, disease recurrent, and medical care inadequate. Prisoners returning from distant work parties could be so exhausted that they crawled. Typhus and other epidemics killed large numbers. On remote islands, sick or unwanted prisoners could simply be allowed to die. Solovki also pioneered the internal hierarchy that would become universal. A prisoner could escape general labor through a technical position, office job, kitchen, workshop, or administrative assignment. Informing, favoritism, professional usefulness, and personal connections became paths toward survival. The injunction to trust no one was already taking shape. Free officials, meanwhile, enjoyed cooks, servants, music, food, and comforts produced by prisoner labor. The contrast between abundance for administrators and starvation for prisoners became structural rather than accidental. The camp also became a laboratory for ideological theater. Criminal prisoners were organized into labor collectives and presented as examples of successful socialist reforging. Shock worker campaigns, competitions, slogans, and statistics claimed that thieves had been transformed into enthusiastic builders. Better rations and conditions were offered to favored groups, while political prisoners remained excluded and underfed. Solzhenitsyn treats much of the reported production success as falsified accounting. The rhetoric of re-education concealed a system in which access to food depended on status and manipulation. At its most brutal, Solovki showed that the state could isolate groups and let them die without public scrutiny. Solzhenitsyn recounts religious sectarians who refused to sign work and ration documents on grounds of conscience. They were sent to a remote island without food after refusing bureaucratic conditions attached to rations. When officials returned 2 months later, only bodies remained. The story stands for the basic asymmetry of power. The administration could turn procedural non-compliance into a death sentence without formally declaring one. By the end of the 1920s, Solovki had changed from a special prison for political and social enemies into a prototype of the generalized corrective labor camp. Criminals, prostitutes, juveniles, political prisoners, and specialists mingled inside an increasingly productive institution. The early mixture of improvisation and cruelty gave way to a model that could be copied elsewhere. Solovki was no longer an exceptional northern prison. It had become the seed from which the larger archipelago would spread. Solovki also contained contradictions that later camp history would reproduce on a larger scale. Prisoner specialists could be indispensable to the same administration that regarded them as politically dangerous. Monks expelled from the religious community might still be kept, temporarily, because only they knew how to maintain particular fisheries, workshops, gardens, or technical systems. Criminal prisoners could be displayed as successfully reforged workers, while political prisoners remained excluded from the favored categories. Cultural events and camp newspapers could coexist with executions, disease, and the punishment sites of Vorkuta. The camp's claim to transform people thus grew beside a practical economy in which officials sought production and personal convenience. Solzhenitsyn sees in Solovki a seed containing many later forms at once: ideological spectacle, exploitation of expertise, informer networks, criminal privilege, arbitrary punishment, and the gradual subordination of every other purpose to labor and security. Solovki's internal life also anticipates the camp's later obsession with classification. Different categories of prisoner could receive different treatment, work, housing, or access to parcels. Political prisoners from older socialist parties still carried memories of pre-revolutionary prison rights and sometimes attempted collective resistance. Religious prisoners could refuse forms, work, or commands as matters of conscience. Criminal prisoners learned that willingness to cooperate with administration could produce privilege. The same fenced territory therefore contained several moral and political worlds, whose differences the administration gradually learned to exploit. Disease provided another hidden selection mechanism. Typhus, scurvy, starvation illnesses, and untreated infections did not appear in a sentence, yet they determined who survived. A nominally temporary punishment could become fatal because the prisoner entered it underfed. A transfer to a remote island or invalid barracks might remove someone from administrative attention entirely. In this environment, the formal distinction between execution and neglect becomes morally thin. One requires an order to kill, the other requires only indifference to predictable death. The transformation of sacred space into prison space gives Solovki an almost symbolic density. Churches become barracks, monastic cells become punishment rooms, and bells and liturgy give way to counts and commands. Yet the old landscape cannot be completely rewritten. Prisoners remain conscious that the buildings were created for another purpose, and the memory of that purpose becomes part of the moral contrast. Solzhenitsyn uses the islands not merely as a chronology of camp administration, but as an image of a civilization capable of converting accumulated spiritual and technical inheritance into machinery of confinement. Chapter 3. The archipelago metastasizes. The expansion of forced labor accelerated when Soviet economic policy changed. Solzhenitsyn links the spread of the camps to the first five-year plan, collectivization, and the drive for extremely rapid industrialization. As unemployment disappeared and the state launched enormous construction projects in remote regions, prisoners became not merely people to be isolated, but a labor resource. Penal policy and economic planning converged. A 1928 government review called for harsher repression of class enemies, expansion of labor colonies, and organization of forced labor so that the state would profit from it. Solovki's population rose dramatically, and its branches spread through Karelia, the Russian north, and toward the Urals. Prisoners built roads, cut timber, explored for oil, constructed chemical plants, and opened mineral deposits. New camps appeared along railway lines and around future industrial centers. Tukhta, Pechora, Vorkuta, Solikamsk, and other names that would later become synonymous with the Gulag emerged from this period. Railroad construction itself demanded additional camp systems, because opening northern resources required transport corridors across territories where free labor was difficult to attract. The result was a geographical transformation. Millions of yards of barbed wire, camp compounds, watchtowers, barracks, agricultural colonies, and work sites appeared across the Soviet Union. Monasteries continued to be converted into prisons, but the camps were no longer confined to inherited buildings. They became instruments for colonizing and industrializing vast spaces. Prisoners with longer terms, especially those sentenced under political articles, were deliberately directed toward distant regions. Distance itself became part of the punishment and part of the economic plan. Solzhenitsyn rejects the camp legend that Frankel personally invented the system. The state had already embraced imprisonment, forced labor, and economic exploitation before Frankel became influential. His importance lay in developing a particularly ruthless and efficient production model. Prisoners were classified according to physical condition, their food was tied to work output, and labor brigades became mechanisms by which the camp transferred pressure from administrators onto prisoners themselves. If the brigade failed its norm, every member could lose food. The result turned fellow prisoners into enforcers of production. The White Sea Baltic Canal became a spectacular demonstration of this approach. The project was presented publicly as a triumph of socialist construction and moral transformation. Writers celebrated former criminals supposedly remade through labor. Prisoners were organized into shock brigades, labor collectives, and competitions, while propaganda promised early release and honors for extraordinary performance. Solzhenitsyn sees behind this language a much harsher reality: impossible deadlines, primitive tools, inadequate food, freezing conditions, and a production system dependent on falsified work records. The brigade became one of the archipelago's most important institutions. It was more effective than direct supervision because a prisoner's ration depended not only on his own output but on that of his companions. An individual who refused to work could lower the whole brigade's percentage and therefore reduce everyone else's food. The pressure of hunger made the brigade leader and fellow prisoners more relentless than guards. What official theorists praised as collective responsibility became, in Solzhenitsyn's account, a method for forcing starving people to police one another. Alongside the brigade developed tukhta, the systematic falsification of production figures. Norms could be impossible to meet honestly. but both prisoners and administrators had reasons to report success. A fictitious quantity of timber, earth, or construction work could move through several layers of paperwork, feeding prisoners through higher ration categories and allowing managers to fulfill plans. The falsification could become so elaborate that non-existent production entered official economic statistics. Solzhenitsyn treats this not primarily as theft for private enrichment, but as a survival response to a state that demanded mathematically impossible results. The broader lesson is that the Gulag expanded not only because the state wished to punish enemies, but because the planned economy discovered uses for coerced labor. Camps opened mines, forests, railways, canals, and industrial districts that free workers might have refused at the offered conditions. Repression supplied the manpower, while economic projects provided an institutional reason to preserve and enlarge repression. The archipelago metastasized because punishment and development became mutually reinforcing. The first 5-year plan in collectivization gave this expanding penal structure a new economic horizon. Industrialization required railroads, mines, forests, canals, power facilities, and settlements in places where free labor was expensive or scarce. Repression generated people who could be sent exactly there. Camps spread from the Solovki system into Karelia and the northern interior, toward Tukhta, the Pechora Basin, Vorkuta, Solikamsk, and other resource regions. The White Sea Baltic Canal then became both a construction project and a public demonstration of what mass force labor supposedly could achieve. Writers and officials celebrated the reforging of criminals through labor, while prisoners were organized into brigades whose collective output determined access to food and sentence credits. Solzhenitsyn's point is that economic demand did not merely make use of an already existing prison population. It helped give the archipelago a reason to keep enlarging. The brigade system was crucial because it transferred the plan downward. A weak man no longer endangered only his own ration. His failure could lower the percentage credited to everyone. Fellow prisoners therefore pushed, threatened, carried, or concealed weakness in ways that saved the administration direct supervisory effort. When impossible norms still could not be met, tukhta supplied the remaining production on paper. In this combination of collective pressure and false accounting, the camp discovered a method capable of translating political repression into apparently measurable economic achievement. The White Sea Baltic Canal provided an especially powerful model because it joined economic construction to ideological spectacle. Prisoners who overfulfilled norms could be praised as shock workers and promised accelerated release. Writers were brought to celebrate how labor supposedly transformed criminals into useful Soviet citizens. Solzhenitsyn seized the public narrative as part of the project itself. The canal was not only dug, it was made into evidence that coercive labor possessed moral and economic superiority. Behind that publicity stood severe time pressure and primitive tools. Prisoners moved earth, rock, and timber under northern conditions, while planners demanded rapid completion. The administration could compensate for missing equipment by adding bodies because prisoner labor was politically cheap. If a brigadier lacked machinery, he could demand more human effort. If the effort still fell short, the production record could be adjusted. The canal therefore became a condensed demonstration of the Gulag formula: ambitious state goals, expendable labor, ration pressure, propaganda, and falsified performance, all supporting the same claim of success. Expansion also changed the type of prisoner the system could absorb. A special purpose camp, holding selected political enemies, is limited by the number of people the authorities can plausibly classify as exceptional. A national labor network can absorb peasants from collectivization, engineers accused of wrecking, common criminals, deported nationalities, wartime prisoners, and later whole new waves. The economic apparatus becomes flexible enough that political policy can generate prisoners without first asking where they will go. The archipelago has become a destination waiting for future categories. Chapter 4. The archipelago hardens. By the mid-1930s, Solzhenitsyn argues, the experimental phase was ending. Official doctrine itself proclaimed that the approach to socialism required not a weakening, but an intensification of state power. Prosecutor Andrei Vyshinsky translated that political principle into penal terms. Corrective labor institutions would grow in importance as instruments of repression, compulsion, and education. The Great Terror, therefore, did not burst into a fundamentally liberal penal system. Institutions, doctrines, and administrative habits had already prepared the way. The remaining signs of prisoner autonomy or legal restraint were stripped away. Labor collectives and forms of camp self-government disappeared. Sentence reductions for productive work were abolished, including credits prisoners believed they had already earned. Visits were restricted, educational programs reduced, wages eliminated or rendered meaningless, and the corrective labor code was ignored. The security apparatus became more powerful relative even to production managers. Guard systems were strengthened with illuminated perimeter fences, military discipline, trained dogs, and stricter convoy rules. The scale of the purges placed the system under enormous physical strain. Camps lacked housing, clothing, food, and medical capacity for the influx. Solzhenitsyn describes mass death from starvation diseases and epidemics, especially during the late 1930s and the war. In such conditions, a secret instruction to reduce prisoner numbers could be fulfilled, not through release, but through exposure, starvation, executions, or lethal work assignments. Whether every reported directive can be documented is less important to his narrative than the visible result. Whole categories of prisoners were consumed faster than the camps could maintain them. One feature was retained and intensified: the privileged position of habitual criminals. The authorities classified thieves as socially closer to the proletariat than political prisoners, and often placed them in positions from which they could dominate, rob, and terrorize Article 58 prisoners. During periods when regular custodial staffs were thin, criminal prisoners could function as an internal police. The combination of official hostility toward politicals and tolerance of criminal violence became one of the Gulag's characteristic methods of control. Solzhenitsyn presents this hardening as the emergence of the camp in the form most later prisoners would recognize. The earlier decorative language of correction remained when useful, but the essential operating principles were naked: work, security, hunger, discipline, and fear. The camp no longer needed to persuade prisoners that they were being transformed. It needed them to produce until their bodies failed. The hardening also removed incentives that earlier prisoners had interpreted as contractual. Productive work had once brought sentence reductions in some camps, creating the expectation that extraordinary effort might shorten captivity. Those credits were abolished, including benefits prisoners believed they had already earned. Visits, correspondence, training, and nominal wages were narrowed or emptied of meaning. The camp ceased pretending that the prisoner could bargain his way toward freedom through exemplary labor. What remained was compulsory production during a fixed or extendable sentence. At the same time, security increasingly dominated other camp departments. Production managers might want a skilled engineer kept alive, while security officials could classify the same person as dangerous. The mature Gulag, therefore, contained internal conflicts, but none restored rights to the prisoner. One branch argued over how to use him, and another over how closely to guard him. Habitual criminals remained useful as informal enforcers against politicals, giving the administration a coercive layer inside the prisoner population. The resulting camp was not a coherent machine in every detail, but all its conflicts occurred within a structure where the inmate had almost no independent claim. The late 1930s also changed the meaning of mortality. Earlier camp administrators might still have incentives to preserve prisoners for future labor or to display successful correction. During mass influx and political terror, replacement bodies arrived faster than the institution could house them. Overcrowding, epidemics, malnutrition, and brutal work could therefore remove prisoners without threatening the supply of labor. Human scarcity had temporarily disappeared from the administrative calculation. War later intensified many of these conditions. Food deteriorated as the entire country suffered shortage, while camp labor remained essential to extraction and construction. The prisoner experienced national emergency without the protections of citizenship. His ration could decline, clothing wear out, and medical resources vanish while work requirements remained. Solzhenitsyn's broader chronology shows why mortality cannot be explained only by local sadism. Central political campaigns repeatedly changed the ratio between bodies arriving, resources available, and production demanded. The removal of sentence credits also changes the meaning of productivity. When extraordinary work could shorten a term, the prisoner at least possessed a rational individual incentive to produce more. Once that path disappeared, output depended increasingly on immediate hunger and coercion. The state replaced a promise about the future with control over the next meal. This is a harsher but administratively simpler system, because the reward can be recalculated every day and never creates an enforceable obligation to release anyone. Chapter 5. What the Archipelago Stands On. This chapter examines the economic mechanism of camp labor. Solzhenitsyn's central claim is that the Gulag depended on an artificial relationship between food and production. A free worker can refuse a job, bargain for wages, or leave. A prisoner cannot. The administration, therefore, had a unique instrument. It could make the ration itself depend on fulfillment of the work norm. The prisoner was compelled to spend energy in order to obtain the calories necessary to continue spending energy. The formula became lethal because the norms were often set beyond what exhausted and underfed people could realistically accomplish. A strong newcomer might temporarily meet them, receive a better ration, and survive. As his strength declined, his output fell, his ration was reduced, and his physical decline accelerated. Solzhenitsyn describes this as a feedback mechanism producing last leggers, people whose bodies had been consumed by the interaction of hunger and labor. The system could claim that low performers received less food because they worked less, while ignoring that they worked less because they were starving. The brigade magnified this pressure. Since production and rations were calculated collectively, one weak prisoner threatened the food of the others. This converted hunger into supervision. A brigadier who manipulated assignments, worksheets, and percentages could determine who ate and who declined. The administration did not need a guard standing beside every shovel because the prisoners, dependents on one another, created its own coercion. Yet the economy could not function according to its official numbers. Hence, tukhta, falsified work accounting. Solzhenitsyn follows the example of logging, where inflated quantities could pass from the felling brigade to the river landing, then to rafting offices, sawmills, lumber yards, and ultimately official statistics. Each stage had an incentive to accept the fiction because its own workers faced impossible norms. Invented timber could become invented processed lumber, carried from one ledger to another until shortages were eventually written off, lost in claims, or disguised as spoilage. This fraud was not necessarily an attack on the state. It often preserved the state's own operations. Managers met plans, ministries reported production, prisoners obtained enough food to remain alive, and free workers earned wages. Solzhenitsyn's conclusion is paradoxical. A system obsessed with accounting created conditions in which systematic falsehood became necessary for survival. The state demanded figures that reality could not supply, so all levels collaborated in manufacturing the required reality on paper. Camp labor therefore stood on several mutually supporting pillars: coercion, hunger, collective pressure, falsified records, and the enormous difference between the official value of prisoner work and the actual cost borne by prisoner bodies. The system appeared cheap because it did not price human exhaustion, illness, or death as genuine economic costs. The archipelago could build quickly precisely because it treated people as an expendable input. Tukhta reveals another feature of the planned camp economy. The lie can travel upward until it becomes part of official reality. A logging brigade inflates felled timber. A landing records the volume as received. Rafting organizations, sawmills, and warehouses inherit numbers they cannot physically verify without jeopardizing their own plans. Missing timber is later attributed to loss, damage, measurement differences, or other accounting categories. In extreme cases, real material that does not fit the paper chain can become almost as inconvenient as missing material. The plan is fulfilled statistically while the actual forest, river, and lumber yard tell a different story. Solzhenitsyn's criticism is therefore not that prisoners were lazy or managers uniquely corrupt. Impossible requirements made falsification rational at every level. A brigadier who recorded the truth could starve his men. A camp chief who recorded the truth could lose his post. A ministry that acknowledged the truth could fail the national plan. The coercive economy generated falsehood structurally. Meanwhile, the true cost of the missing production was carried in weakened bodies, forests cut irrationally, equipment ruined, and projects whose nominal cheapness excluded the human lives spent on them. The ration scale also encouraged brigadiers to manufacture intermediate categories of performance. A man recorded at 1% might receive enough bread to keep working. Recorded slightly lower, he might begin the decline from which he would never recover. The sheet was therefore not an abstract statistic. It translated directly into calories. A compassionate or corrupt norm setter could falsify upward, but that merely confirmed that official truth was incompatible with physical survival. Solzhenitsyn argues that the apparent cheapness of forced labor depended on excluding exactly these facts from economic calculation. The state did not pay a market wage, but it incurred huge guard, transport, prison, medical, and administrative costs. More importantly, it treated the death or disablement of a worker as a replenishable loss rather than the destruction of human capital. Skilled people could spend years pushing wheelbarrows, while unskilled officials directed projects they barely understood. The ledger can make such labor look inexpensive only if the prisoner's life is valued at almost nothing. The falsification of production also creates a moral trap for honest specialists. An engineer or accountant who insists on accurate figures may expose his brigade to lower rations and his camp to accusations of failing the plan. Truth becomes socially destructive inside a system whose targets are detached from reality. Conversely, the official who lies can appear humane because his false numbers keep people fed. Solzhenitsyn sees here a miniature of a broader Soviet dilemma. The plan rewards ideological truthfulness in speeches, while material survival can require factual dishonesty in records. Chapter 6. They've brought the fascists. Solzhenitsyn now moves from institutional history into his own first encounter with camp labor. In August 1945, he and other Article 58 prisoners were transported from Moscow to the Novy Jerusalem camp. The short truck ride through ordinary streets and green countryside felt almost like liberation after prison. Colors, wind, cut grass, and open space overwhelmed men accustomed to walls. When they entered the camp, younger prisoners shouted that the fascists had arrived. The nickname, applied to political prisoners, demonstrated how completely official hostility had penetrated camp slang. At first, the small camp did not look terrifying. Its barbed wire allowed views of surrounding fields and villages. That first impression vanished quickly. Veteran inmates described it as a starvation station. Solzhenitsyn realized that survival depended on escaping general labor, yet he did not know how camp society worked. Within hours, other newcomers found protected assignments through skills, acquaintances, or opportunism. Each success intensified his fear that the remaining men would be left for the work that killed. Daily life stripped away ordinary expectations. Prisoners slept on bare communal bunks without bedding, guarded their shoes and clothing from theft, stored personal belongings under camp control, stood through long and pointless counts, and carried all possessions with them because anything left unattended could disappear. Time was consumed by roll calls, queues, searches, meals, marches, and administrative routines that produced nothing except submission. Solzhenitsyn and his friend Boris Gamarov eventually landed in a clay pit serving a brickyard. Their assignment was to load heavy clay into rail cars. Rain transformed the pit into a red swamp. Their old military coats became saturated, their boots rotted, and their hands numbed from wet clay. The norm remained. The official slogan that weather did not stop socialist construction meant that prisoners worked through conditions in which useful work itself became irrational. At first, the two intellectuals tried to defend themselves mentally with literature, philosophy, and irony. They joked about Chekhov's characters dreaming of the dignity of labor and discussed Vladimir Solovyov. But hunger and physical exhaustion gradually consumed the capacity for abstract thought. Gamarov, already weakened by a wartime shell fragment in his lung, deteriorated rapidly. Conversation itself required energy they no longer possessed. Their ration amounted to thin soup, gruel, and a small fixed quantity of bread. Wet clothing could not be dried, barracks were cold, and work continued the next day. Prisoners in the brickyard even searched coal piles for edible clay-like material, because filling the stomach with something inert could reduce the sensation of hunger. Solzhenitsyn presents this detail as an introduction to the camp's central lesson. Civilization can be peeled away by calories, cold, and exhaustion, much faster than a newcomer imagines. The chapter ends with the prisoners sitting soaked in darkness after a futile workday, knowing that tomorrow will reproduce today. Solzhenitsyn recalls that during war he had prayed to survive shells and bombs. In the camp, he found himself praying for death. The transition from decorated officer to starving laborer had taken only months. The purpose of the chapter is to make the institutional mechanisms described earlier bodily concrete. The archipelago's economics operated through cold skin, empty stomachs, failing muscles, and the gradual surrender of the will. The humiliations in Novy Jerusalem also teach Solzhenitsyn how quickly social identity is redistributed inside camp. A decorated frontline officer arrives with assumptions about courage, education, and military service, yet none of them purchase bread. Men who understand the camp economy better than he does immediately seek jobs as barbers, clerks, mechanics, or planners. Their practical intelligence matters more than his former rank. The newcomer who fails to secure such a niche descends into the clay pit. In freedom, Solzhenitsyn might have judged these maneuvers as opportunism. In camp, he begins to understand them as the first lesson of survival. The physical decline of Boris Gamarov makes the lesson personal. His damaged lung and weakening body cannot negotiate with the production norm. The two men initially try to preserve the intellectual world from which they came, but the effort becomes almost absurd against cold mud and starvation. The chapter deliberately narrows from the history of an enormous institution to the body's simplest facts. A system described through decrees, plans, and ministries ultimately acts through whether a wet coat can dry, whether a lung can breathe, and whether the stomach receives enough energy for another day's work. The chapter also shows how the label fascist could detach completely from actual biography. Solzhenitsyn and other Soviet officers who had fought Germany arrived as Article 58 prisoners and were greeted by a term associated with the enemy they had just helped defeat. In camp, official classification had greater social force than wartime service. The word did not describe political analysis. It marked a caste that criminals and camp veterans knew could be treated as legitimate prey. This inversion deepens Solzhenitsyn's sense that camp is a separate civilization. Outside the fence, he had possessed medals, command responsibility, and the prestige of victory. Inside, an experienced thief or a barber with connections understood the world better than he did. A man's past mattered only where it could be converted into a useful trade, a relationship, or an accusation. Everything else was stripped down to the present contest between the work norm and the body. There is also a cruel contrast between the recent war and camp labor. At the front, physical danger had been accompanied by comradeship, responsibility, movement, and a recognized national purpose. In camp, the same military coat and body are redirected toward a task whose purpose the prisoner neither chose nor respects. He can survive artillery and then be broken by hunger while loading clay. Solzhenitsyn's reversal of his wartime prayer captures the difference. Danger had once made life precious. Camp could make death feel like release. Solzhenitsyn's first 6 chapters of Part 3 therefore trace a deliberate progression. The early revolutionary camp establishes the political right to isolate enemies. Solevsky creates a laboratory in which forced labor, informer networks, criminal privilege, punishment, and exploitation of specialists can be tested together. Industrialization supplies a reason to multiply the model across the country. The 1930s removed the remaining contractual and legal restraints. The ration norm provides the daily economic lever, while falsified accounting allows impossible plans to appear fulfilled. Finally, his own arrival in 1945 shows what these abstractions mean to one body. The historical argument and the personal experience are two views of the same system. This progression also explains why Solzhenitsyn resists explanations centered on one especially ingenious administrator. Franco can refine methods, Wyszynski can justify them, and individual chiefs can make particular camps more or less murderous, but the archipelago does not depend on a single inventor. It grows because political classification, forced labor, economic planning, security bureaucracy, and secrecy become mutually supporting institutions. Removing one personality would not automatically remove the structure they learn to serve. Chapter 7. The Way of Life and Customs of the Natives. Having shown his own first descent into general labor, Solzhenitsyn broadens the view to the ordinary physical existence of the camp prisoner. General work is the great destroyer. It includes logging, quarrying, mining, road construction, peat cutting, earth moving, agriculture, loading, and the other forms of heavy labor that consume calories faster than the camp supplies them. A prisoner assigned to such work has almost no control over the central variables of survival. He cannot choose the job, the hours, the weather, the clothing, the food, or the pace. His sentence may say 8 or 10 years, but his actual life expectancy is determined day by strength, ration category, work assignment, and luck. Logging stands in Solzhenitsyn's account as the father of all camp labor. The prisoner must walk through deep snow to the cutting site, fell trees, trim branches, drag and stack timber, and then return to camp after dark. The work combines cold, wet clothing, dangerous tools, long marches, and enormous production norms. In wartime camps, prisoners could describe a few weeks on logging as a kind of dry execution. A man did not need to be formally condemned to death. If his strength was already low, the forest could finish the sentence. Solzhenitsyn repeatedly compares Soviet camp labor with older forms of Russian hard labor, not to romanticize the Tsarist penal system, but to show how radically the scale had changed. 19th century political prisoners could complain of work that, by Gulag standards, sometimes resembled a limited workday. The Soviet camp combined industrial planning with the prisoner's inability to refuse. The norm could be raised according to the needs of a plan, even when the tools, terrain, weather, or bodies made fulfillment impossible. Cold did not necessarily provide relief. Regulations might declare that work should stop below a certain temperature, but the camp had methods for making the rule harmless. A day could be officially recorded as too cold for normal work, while prisoners were nevertheless sent outside, with production redistributed on paper or attributed to another period. Thermometers could be placed where readings were convenient. The distinction between written regulation and lived reality mattered little when the same administration controlled the measurement, the record, and the prisoner. Food remained the center around which camp psychology revolved. Bread was weighed, watched, divided, hidden, stolen, and dreamed about. Soup might contain little more than water and traces of vegetables or grain. Meat and fats disappeared through a chain of theft before reaching the prisoners. Even if the official ration looked sufficient on paper, everyone who handled food between warehouse and bowl had opportunities to remove part of it. The prisoner at the end of the chain received what remained. The ration system then converted hunger into a judgment about moral worth. A prisoner who fulfilled the norm received more. One who failed received less. Yet failure was often the consequence of undernourishment. The camp could therefore describe the dying man as a poor worker rather than as a man being starved. When he finally became a last-legger, barely able to stand, he could be transferred to a weakened brigade, hospital, or invalid team, but by then recovery was uncertain. New prisoners arrived strong enough to replace those whose bodies had been used up. Solzhenitsyn sketches the stages through which a newcomer loses his former self. At first he may still protect his clothing, argue over fairness, conserve energy rationally, and think about the years ahead. Then hunger narrows the horizon. The next meal becomes more real than the sentence. A spoon, a dry place on the bunk, a slightly larger piece of bread, or exemption from one work detail becomes a major event. Intellectual interests can survive, but only by competing against the body's constant demand for food, warmth, and sleep. The camp thus develops customs that are not exotic additions to prison life, but adaptations to scarcity. Prisoners learn to sleep instantly when given the chance, to eat slowly or quickly according to danger, to hide food from thieves, to obtain extra clothing through barter, to judge a brigadier's character, to identify a possible soft assignment, and to measure another person's physical decline at a glance. The native of the archipelago is formed by a society in which every ordinary human need has become administrative leverage. The workday also destroys the prisoner's ability to plan over the full length of a sentence. A 10-year term is psychologically impossible to carry as a single object when the body is struggling to complete the next shift. Camp wisdom therefore reduces time to smaller units. Reach dinner, return from the forest, survive winter, avoid the hospital ward from which few return, keep the boots dry for another week. This shrinking of the future is itself a form of domination. The state has not only confined the prisoner geographically, it has compressed his imagination until tomorrow's ration can eclipse the life he once expected to live. Solzhenitsyn emphasizes that even official exemptions from labor can be unstable. A sick man may be sent back too soon because the camp needs workers. Medical personnel themselves are prisoners, or subordinate to production administrators. A doctor's diagnosis therefore competes with the plan. The camp's way of life is produced by this constant priority. The body is valuable chiefly while it can still be translated into output. Solzhenitsyn also contrasts the camp work norm with the fiction that labor is rehabilitative. Work becomes morally meaningless when the prisoner is ordered to perform it, regardless of weather, health, usefulness, or result. A man may labor intensely on a task he knows is wasteful because refusal is punished, and the norm determines bread. Hatred of labor is then not evidence of antisocial character, but a rational response to labor converted into coercion. This helps explain why release can leave former prisoners physically unable to associate work with dignity. The institution that claims to educate through labor has taught them to experience labor as an enemy. Chapter 8. Women in Camp. Women enter the same machinery of arrest, sentence, transport, hunger, and labor, but Solzhenitsyn argues that camp conditions create additional forms of vulnerability. In mixed camps, the imbalance between men and women and the power of male administrators, trustees, guards, and brigadiers makes sexuality inseparable from survival. A woman may be offered lighter work, food, protection, or exemption from dangerous assignments in exchange for a relationship. The formal language of voluntary intimacy can therefore conceal coercion produced by hunger and unequal power. Some women attach themselves to officials or privileged prisoners because the alternative is general labor. Others resist and are punished with the hardest assignments. Solzhenitsyn does not reduce every camp relationship to prostitution. Affection, loyalty, jealousy, tenderness, and genuine love survive. But the institution continually places pressure on those emotions by making food, shelter, and work dependent on status. A relationship that might have been freely chosen outside can become impossible to disentangle from protection inside. Pregnancy introduces another grim calculation. A pregnant woman could receive some relief from the most destructive labor, and childbirth might create a temporary route away from logging or construction. Under conditions where general work could kill, pregnancy could therefore acquire a survival value separate from the desire for a child. In some camps, the number of pregnancies rose sharply. The administration responded not by altering the underlying labor system, but by regulating mothers, nurseries, and separation. The children themselves lived within institutions shaped by the camp. Mothers might see infants only at feeding times. Nursery workers cared for large groups under conditions of shortage, and disease spread easily. A mother who returned from work exhausted might have little time with her child before being sent back to barracks. The baby's existence could protect her body for a period, yet the same camp system could later separate them. Solzhenitsyn's point is not that prisoners cynically produced children for rations. It is that a system which made pregnancy one of the few physical refuges from lethal labor distorted the most intimate decisions. Post-war authorities attempted to impose sexual order by separating male and female camp zones. Solzhenitsyn presents the reform as another example of an administrative solution producing new hardships. Women who had previously obtained some lighter positions through mixed camp arrangements could now be required to perform the full range of heavy labor themselves. Logging and other jobs officially considered unsuitable for women did not disappear, merely because the sexes had been separated. The separation also failed to extinguish sexuality. Fences became higher, forbidden zones wider, guards more attentive, and in some places electric barriers were introduced, yet men and women found methods of correspondence in secret meetings. Messages passed through work sites, hospital contacts, hidden notes, and cracks in the camp system. At Kingir, Solzhenitsyn describes relationships conducted across walls, including Lithuanian Catholics who considered themselves married through religious promises, even when physical contact was almost impossible. Women formed relationships with other women as well, and camp doctors observed how prolonged separation altered sexual life. Solzhenitsyn treats these phenomena not as sensational exceptions, but as evidence that administrative power cannot simply abolish human attachment. The state could dictate where bodies slept and worked, but could not completely regulate desire. This survival of eros is one of the chapter's paradoxes. Camp sexuality can be degraded into bargaining, exploitation, jealousy, and violence. Yet it can also become a form of resistance to total depersonalization. A prisoner who loves another person has created a loyalty not fully owned by the administration. The same emotional force can make her vulnerable to blackmail, but it can also preserve a part of life the camp has failed to reduce to production norms. The treatment of motherhood shows the same priority in another form. Infants require milk, warmth, cleanliness, and continuity of care, but the camp is organized around labor deployment. The mother's body is temporarily reclassified because pregnancy and nursing impose biological limits, not because the institution recognizes a family right. Once those limits pass, work claims her again. The child remains inside a nursery system where administrative convenience may determine feeding schedules and contact. Solzhenitsyn sees the arrangement as a grotesque inversion of social policy. The state that proclaims special concern for mothers and children had created conditions in which motherhood became simultaneously refuge, vulnerability, and another regulated category. He also notes that the moral judgments made outside camp become unreliable inside it. A free observer may condemn the woman who attaches herself to a privileged official or seeks pregnancy for relief. The prisoner sees the alternative: wet logging, starvation, illness, and perhaps death. Gulag repeatedly forces choices between values that ordinary life allows people to keep together. Bodily survival can require conduct the same person would reject under freedom. The separation policy thus demonstrates a recurring Gulag mistake. Officials treat a social problem as something that can be solved by fences. Men and women are separated physically, but the causes of exploitation remain hunger, unequal power, and the desperate value of privilege. New fences rearrange those pressures rather than eliminate them. Human beings continue finding routes for attachment, because the need for intimacy does not vanish when administration declares it forbidden. Women also reveal the importance of informal economies inside camp. A scrap of cloth, a needle, a little food, access to a warm room, or the ability to wash can be exchanged through networks invisible to official ration tables. Because women are often concentrated in particular workshops, hospitals, or service jobs, these networks can provide survival resources unavailable through formal channels. The same networks can also expose them to theft and coercion. Camp life is never exhausted by the written regulations, because scarcity creates a second economy of favors and dependencies. Chapter 9. The Trustees. The social structure of Gulag cannot be understood, Solzhenitsyn argues, by dividing everyone simply into prisoners and guards. Inside the prisoner population stands a broad class of trustees, inmates who have escaped the killing pressure of ordinary general labor through administrative, technical, medical, service, or supervisory jobs. They may be clerks, cooks, bread cutters, storekeepers, tailors, shoemakers, doctors, orderlies, accountants, norm setters, planners, engineers, foremen, dispatchers, bathhouse workers, or people assigned to offices and workshops. The difference between such a position and a shovel brigade can be the difference between life and death. This fact complicates moral judgment. A prisoner does not necessarily become a villain merely because he obtains a protected job. If general labor is steadily consuming bodies, seeking a soft assignment can be simple self-preservation. Solzhenitsyn himself did it. The camp's cruelty lies partly in making survival depend on climbing out of the condition imposed on the majority. Officially, political prisoners sentenced under Article 58 were often supposed to be excluded from positions of trust. In practice, the camp economy needed engineers, doctors, accountants, technicians, and educated specialists, and those categories contained large numbers of Article 58 prisoners. Rules were therefore bent whenever production required expertise. The state could declare a man politically dangerous while simultaneously trusting him to calculate structures, manage equipment, treat patients, or organize production. The moral danger begins when a prisoner's protected position gives him power over the survival of others. A bread cutter controls grams that matter desperately. A work assigner can send one prisoner to a warm workshop and another to logging. A norm setter can decide whether a brigade officially fulfills the plan, and therefore what ration its members receive. A cook can skim food. A medical worker can certify someone as sick or return him to labor. In ordinary life, these might be minor administrative decisions. In camp, they can determine whether a body recovers or collapses. Solzhenitsyn recounts his own efforts to become a trustee. At a Moscow area camp, he obtained work connected with production norms and found himself moving above ordinary laborers, literally able at moments to look out from roofs at the city beyond the zone. The change in physical conditions was immediate, yet protected positions were unstable. Cliques formed, influential prisoners displaced weaker ones, and a person who had escaped the shovel could be sent back to it when another group acquired favor. He examines the figure of the Soviet engineer or manager who carries free world authoritarian habits into camp administration. One example, identified by an initial, had learned before arrest to command subordinates, enjoy privileges, and treat labor primarily as a resource to be driven. Such a man could adapt to camp management with disturbing ease. The surrounding political system had already trained him in behaviors that the Gulag merely intensified. Trustees therefore form neither a separate moral species nor an innocent occupational category. Some use their position to protect others, falsify norms upward, hide exhausted prisoners, distribute food fairly, or keep people out of deadly assignments. Others become predators, who reproduce the values of the administration. The same structural advantage can be used for mercy or domination. Solzhenitsyn's own participation prevents him from writing about the trustees as an outsider. Hunger and fear teach the prisoner to value a desk, a pencil, a warm room, or a technical assignment more intensely than he would ever have imagined in freedom. Once he possesses such a privilege, he has something to lose. The administration can then use that fear of falling back into general work to obtain obedience. The hierarchy of trustees is thus one of the ways the camp makes prisoners help administer the conditions that threaten them. Because the protected job can be taken away, the trustee's privilege creates dependence rather than independence. A clerk who falsifies a worksheet to help a brigade risks being returned to the shovel if discovered. A doctor who protects too many weak prisoners can be accused of undermining production. A bread cutter who refuses to skim rations for influential people can lose the position. The moral value of a soft job, therefore, depends partly on what the prisoner is willing to do to keep it. Solzhenitsyn's analysis also explains why survivors are statistically unrepresentative of the original camp population. Men and women who remain for years are disproportionately those who obtain lighter assignments, possess useful trades, receive parcels, develop connections, or adapt successfully to camp hierarchy. The dead from general labor cannot later write memoirs explaining the conditions that killed them. Any history based on survivors must therefore remember the invisible selection built into survival itself. The camp hierarchy also changes how prisoners judge one another after the fact. Survivors may be tempted to say that anyone who died on general work simply failed to adapt, while people who never had the opportunity for a soft assignment disappear from the story. Solzhenitsyn resists this survivor's morality. Cleverness, skill, health, chance, age, and the whim of an official all-influence who reaches a protected post. Survival can testify to resourcefulness without proving superior virtue. Chapter 10. In place of politicals. Solzhenitsyn now asks what became of the political prisoner in the older European sense. A person consciously opposed to the government because of a political, religious, or moral conviction. Soviet camps were full of prisoners classified as political under Article 58. Yet many had never organized against the state at all. The category had expanded so far that ordinary gestures, jokes, negligence, private speech, and accidental associations could become political crimes. He assembles examples whose absurdity is part of the argument. A needle can pierce a newspaper portrait of a Soviet leader and become evidence of hostile intent. Soap or clothing can be placed against an image of Stalin. A bust can be carried in a way interpreted as disrespect. A soldier can praise a piece of German military equipment and receive years for anti-Soviet agitation. Schoolchildren can repeat a rhyme or make a private political comment and enter the same legal category as conspirators. The political article no longer distinguishes between organized resistance and the innumerable ways human beings can offend an ideological state. This breadth, Solzhenitsyn argues, is not merely bureaucratic foolishness. Indiscriminate terror has a political function. If punishment followed clearly defined acts, citizens could protect themselves by avoiding those acts. When the boundaries are uncertain, everyone must monitor speech, friendships, jokes, letters, and even facial expressions. The state may imprison thousands who never intended resistance, but in doing so, it also catches some who did. More importantly, it teaches the whole population that safety cannot be secured through innocence alone. There were nevertheless prisoners with genuine convictions. Religious believers could refuse to renounce worship or comply with commands they considered sinful. National activists resisted Soviet incorporation. Young people sometimes formed groups, wrote leaflets, or debated alternatives. Solzhenitsyn describes high school students around 1950 who produced appeals asking workers to compare official claims with their lived conditions. Their political organization was tiny and immature, yet they received long sentences in special camps. The state had succeeded in making even adolescent discussion appear as a security threat. Trotskyists and members of older socialist currents represented another surviving political type. Many had spent years in exile, isolators, and camps, preserving internal doctrines and fierce factional identities. Solzhenitsyn admires their willingness to resist, while criticizing the sectarian blindness that sometimes prevented them from recognizing the suffering of people outside their own tradition. Even in prison, they could retain the old revolutionary habit of dividing humanity by ideological line. The Great Vorkuta hunger strike of 1936 and 1937 becomes the chapter's clearest example of organized political resistance. Hundreds of opposition prisoners demanded that politicals be separated from criminals, that the workday be limited, that political rations not depend on production norms, and that extrajudicial sentencing by the special board be abolished. They maintained the strike for roughly 4 months, an extraordinary act of collective discipline under prison conditions. The authorities eventually gave assurances that appeared to meet major demands. The prisoners ended the strike. The promises were not honored. In the period that followed, many of the strikers were isolated, transferred, and eventually shot. Solzhenitsyn presents the sequence as a decisive lesson in the difference between older prison politics and the mature Soviet system. A hunger strike assumes an authority that can be shamed, negotiated with, or constrained by public opinion. Once the state controls both the prison and the information surrounding it, collective self-sacrifice can simply identify the people who most need to be destroyed. The chapter's title is therefore deliberately bitter. The Gulag contains millions labeled political, while the historical traditions of political imprisonment have largely been broken. The state has filled the category with accidental victims, at the same time that it has exterminated the organized political cultures capable of collective resistance. The grotesque Article 58 cases also reveal the peculiar importance of interpretation. The material act may be harmless. A portrait is damaged accidentally, a bust is handled awkwardly, a remark compares military equipment, or young people discuss public conditions. What turns the act into a political crime is the official decision that it expresses hostile intention. Once that interpretation is accepted, punishment can become severe without any need to show that the state was actually endangered. This is why Solzhenitsyn gives so much attention to the small number who really did resist consciously. Their existence proves that the regime did face opposition, but it also exposes the absurdity of treating millions of accidental victims as if all belonged to the same conspiracy. The system's genius was to erase distinctions between thought, speech, organization, sabotage, and mere misfortune under one political vocabulary. Genuine opposition disappeared into a sea of manufactured political guilt. The older political traditions are especially threatening to the camp because they contain techniques of collective action. Religious communities preserve shared prohibitions. Socialists remember hunger strikes and elected representatives. National groups possess languages and loyalties that precede the Soviet state. Repression therefore seeks not merely to confine individuals, but to break the continuity through which such groups teach one generation of prisoners how another generation resisted. Once that memory disappears, each newcomer must invent resistance again from almost nothing. The fate of organized political prisoners also illustrates why historical memory matters to Solzhenitsyn's entire project. Once the old socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks, anarchists, opposition communists, and religious communities are dispersed or killed, later prisoners can mistake their own atomized condition for something inevitable. Reconstructing earlier resistance shows that prisoners once possessed collective traditions the mature system deliberately destroyed. The loss of those traditions is itself one of Gulag's victories. Chapter 11. The Loyalists. Among the most psychologically puzzling inhabitants of the archipelago are prisoners who remain devoted to the Soviet system even after it has arrested and sentenced them. Solzhenitsyn approaches them with both sympathy and anger. He distinguishes people who retain sincere socialist or communist convictions while quietly sharing the burdens of prison from what he calls the hard-headed loyalists, prisoners who insist loudly that the party and state remain fundamentally right and that only their own case has somehow been mishandled. To sharpen the definition, he cites Anna Skripnikova's idea that a genuine political prisoner is someone who possesses convictions whose renunciation could end the conflict with the authorities. A religious believer can renounce faith, an oppositionist can repudiate a political program, a nationalist can abandon a national cause, but an orthodox communist, arrested by the same state he supports, may have no opposing belief to surrender. His tragedy is different. He has been classified as an enemy without having first become one. Some loyal communists behave with dignity. They do not demand privileges, inform on others, or use doctrine as a weapon against fellow prisoners. Solzhenitsyn describes men who preserve a belief in socialism while accepting the evidence of suffering around them. They may see their arrest as a terrible failure of institutions, without pretending that everyone else in camp deserves to be there. The hardhead takes another path. He explains his own arrest as an error, but continues to assume that arrests in general must be justified. If another prisoner is a peasant, priest, nationalist, former white, foreigner, or political critic, there must have been a reason. The state is presumed correct at the systemic level even when it is demonstrably wrong. In the one case the loyalist knows perfectly, his own. This psychological defense can survive interrogation, sentence, transport, and camp. Former prosecutors or officials who once helped send people into the system may enter as prisoners and remain astonished that the legal machinery has touched them. Instead of revising their understanding of the machinery, they search for a personal explanation, a malicious subordinate, a local excess, an enemy inside the organs, a temporary distortion, or a leader who would correct the case if only he knew. Solzhenitsyn sees in this attitude the strength of ideological identity. To admit that the system itself is capable of arbitrary injustice would require reinterpreting an entire life, including one's own participation in institutions that harmed others. It is psychologically easier to believe that the prison is full of guilty people plus one inexplicable mistake. The hardheads can become useful to camp administration. Because they regard themselves as politically reliable, they may seek office or technical positions and distinguish themselves sharply from other Article 58 prisoners. Some condemn escapes or protests as genuine anti-Soviet behavior. Some cooperate with security, convinced that exposing real enemies remains a patriotic duty, even from inside the wire. A man can therefore be both a victim of repression and an active defender of the principles sustaining it. Solzhenitsyn extends the observation beyond particular Soviet prisoners. Political leaders in other communist countries who themselves experience prison could later return to power without necessarily rejecting the structures of one-party coercion. Personal suffering does not automatically generate liberalism. A prisoner can leave a cell with the same worldview he brought into it if every contradiction has been assigned to exceptional mistakes. The chapter is ultimately about the difficulty of learning from experience when experience threatens identity. The camp presents overwhelming evidence, but evidence does not interpret itself. One prisoner loses faith, another deepens it, and a third divides reality into compartments, so that faith never has to confront the whole. The archipelago can imprison the body while leaving ideology almost untouched. The loyalist can even turn camp hardship into further proof of doctrine. If thieves are brutal, he sees the criminal legacy of the old society. If production fails, he blames wreckers or incompetent local officials. If a guard is cruel, that is an individual excess. If another political prisoner criticizes the system, the loyalist may take the criticism as confirmation that real enemies do exist among the falsely accused. Every observation is absorbed without forcing revision of the central faith. Solzhenitsyn's anger is strongest when this conviction becomes a reason to judge fellow prisoners. Someone who has personally learned how a fabricated case works still repeats that other people must have done something. The refusal of solidarity allows the state's categories to survive inside the camp population itself. The prisoner's file has been falsified, but he continues to believe the neighboring files. Solzhenitsyn's distinction is not intended to deny the sincerity of communists, who suffer bravely. What he attacks is the moral asymmetry by which the loyalist demands infinite contextual understanding for his own false case, while granting none to people outside his ideological family. Camp could have become overwhelming evidence of a general principle. No state should possess such unreviewable power over accusation. Instead, some prisoners continue asking only that the power be used more accurately. Chapter 12. Knock, knock, knock. No camp administration, however heavily guarded, can know what prisoners say in barracks, work sites, hospital wards, kitchens, and queues without help from inside. The informer therefore becomes one of the essential figures of the archipelago. Solzhenitsyn lists the changing terms for the secret collaborator: stool pigeon, secret co-worker, plant, informer. Prison slang reduces the whole apparatus to the sound of knocking. The invisible report, passing from prisoner to security. Recruitment can begin in freedom or after arrest. The methods are often ordinary rather than theatrical. An officer appeals to patriotism. Are you a Soviet person? He offers a soft job, extra food, favorable treatment, a reduction of sentence, or protection from transfer. If persuasion fails, he can threaten general labor, a punishment camp, a new case, or consequences for relatives. Since almost every prisoner possesses a weak point, the administration does not need everyone to cooperate. It needs enough people to make everyone suspect that anyone might. The psychological effect exceeds the information actually collected. A barracks in which one known informer exists teaches prisoners to assume there may be several unknown ones. Friendship becomes dangerous. Political discussion can produce a second term. A joke can travel to an officer through 3 intermediaries. The prisoner, therefore, learns to censor himself even in captivity, where the state has already taken most other freedoms. Security sections also possess an institutional incentive to discover conspiracies. During wartime, officers serving in camp may justify remaining away from the front by demonstrating that their internal security work is indispensable. An actual quiet camp can therefore become professionally inconvenient. Informers supply names, rumors, resentments, and fragments of conversation from which a plot can be assembled. Solzhenitsyn describes cases in which fictitious underground groups expanded through repeated interrogation. One prisoner is persuaded or tortured into naming another. The second is shown evidence that appears to come independently from the first. More names emerge. Eventually, the paperwork describes an organization with leaders, cells, and intentions that never existed outside the investigation. Prisoners already serving one sentence receive another, and camp security proves its vigilance. The late 1930s show where this logic can lead when quotas and political terror converge. Solzhenitsyn turns to mass executions in the northern camps, including the operations associated with the names Garanin and Kashketin. The details come through surviving prisoners rather than complete official records, but the pattern is unmistakable. Groups were isolated, accused of renewed counter-revolutionary activity inside camp, and removed in batches for shooting. At Vorkuta, many participants in the Great Hunger Strike and other opposition prisoners were concentrated under harsh conditions. In April 1938, large groups were marched out into the tundra and machine-gunned. Solzhenitsyn describes further killings conducted in smaller batches, including shootings in spaces prepared so blood could be managed afterward. The bureaucratic secrecy of the operation matters as much as its violence. People disappeared from one part of the camp system without the public event that execution would have created in ordinary society. Even executioners and officials could later be arrested and shot, helping erase knowledge of earlier operations. The system consumed witnesses to its own acts. Solzhenitsyn recounts still more extreme stories, including prisoners said to have been buried while alive because transporting living bodies was easier than moving corpses. Such accounts reveal why his history depends so heavily on testimony. The institutions responsible for the killings had every reason not to preserve accessible evidence. The chapter connects the quiet act of informing with mass terror. A whispered report seems far removed from a firing squad, yet the institutional chain joins them. Security needs information. Information becomes accusation. Accusation becomes organization. Organization becomes renewed political danger, and renewed political danger justifies punishment. The knock at the door of a security office is therefore one of the sounds on which the archipelago rests. The informer's power is greatest because his report is usually invisible to the person harmed by it. A prisoner can be summoned for interrogation months after a conversation and never learn which sentence or acquaintance opened the new case. This uncertainty spreads responsibility so widely that even innocent social behavior becomes dangerous. Silence is safer, but silence also isolates prisoners from the very relationships that might help them endure. The mass killings described at the end of the chapter show the ultimate destination of that informational system. Once a security section has produced a category such as an underground Trotskyist center or camp rebellion, individuals can be processed collectively. The official file supplies the language, armed units supply the physical force, and secrecy prevents outside judgment. The informer at one end and the execution detail at the other belong to the same administrative chain, even when neither sees the whole. Informing also helps explain why even close friendships in camp can develop unusual intensity and unusual fragility. To trust someone is to risk more than embarrassment. It can mean a new sentence. When prisoners nevertheless share forbidden opinions, plans, or memories, they are staking part of their future on another person's silence. The security section depends on making such trust irrational. Its success is measured not only in cases opened, but in conversations that never occur. The informer system finally contaminates historical evidence itself. A deposition may survive in an archive and look like a direct statement by a prisoner, while the circumstances that produced it are absent. Solzhenitsyn repeatedly warns the reader to distinguish documentary existence from factual truth. Gulag was a bureaucracy capable of generating enormous quantities of paper, but the paper often records what the institution needed people to say, rather than what actually happened. Chapter 13. Hand over your second skin too. A sentence in the Gulag does not guarantee that the prisoner will ever reach its end. Solzhenitsyn calls the additional term imposed on someone already imprisoned a second skin. A man serving 5, 8, or 10 years can be investigated again inside camp, convicted again, and discover that the calendar on which he has based his endurance is meaningless. Some acquire a third or fourth skin. The result is a special form of insecurity. Even perfect obedience cannot establish a definite future. The practice was particularly common during periods of political panic. In the late 1930s, prisoners whose original cases had already removed them from society could be accused of creating new anti-Soviet organizations behind the wire. During the war, the pressure took another form. Security officers serving safely in camp had reason to prove that internal enemies required their continued presence away from combat. A camp without conspiracies could make the security section appear unnecessary. A camp full of discovered conspirators demonstrated vigilance. The ingredients for a new case were abundant. Prisoners complained about food, mocked officials, remembered life before arrest, discussed military news, criticized Stalin, formed friendships, shared religious beliefs, or simply knew one another from the same profession. An informer could report a phrase. The investigator could then ask whether the speaker had discussed the same idea with someone else. Friendship became organization. Conversation became agitation. Frustration became preparation for revolt. Solzhenitsyn describes cases in which prisoners were simply required to sign acknowledgement of new terms or administrative decisions without anything resembling a fresh trial. Refusal could produce punishment without changing the result. Other prisoners endured full interrogations inside camp, including exhaustion, isolation, threats, and manipulation of rations. The techniques described in Volume 1 did not end once the prisoner had been sentenced. They traveled with him into the archipelago. One example involves the fabrication of wartime conspiracies in northern and eastern camps. Officials assembled supposed anti-Soviet groups from exhausted prisoners, often men physically incapable of serious rebellion. The very absurdity of the charge could make resistance difficult, because the accused had no factual event around which to build a defense. He had to disprove an organization that existed only in depositions controlled by the investigator. Solzhenitsyn tells of Babich, a former Arctic explorer, caught in such a process. Hunger and interrogation were combined. Food could be placed within sight, while a starving man was pressured to produce the required story. Under enough exhaustion, a prisoner could accept a fictional role simply to end the immediate torment. His confession then became evidence against other people, who in turn supplied evidence against him. The same method appears in cases at places such as Ust-Vym and Jita, where groups of prisoners were accused of renewed conspiracy. Camp society was already organized into work brigades, national groups, professional friendships, and barracks acquaintances, so investigators never lacked connections to reinterpret. The more people they arrested, the denser the network appeared on paper. A second sentence also served a practical purpose. A skilled prisoner nearing release represented the loss of labor and expertise. A troublesome prisoner whose behavior had become politically inconvenient could be retained. A man who had survived one cycle of camp and begun counting the months could be returned psychologically to the beginning. The sentence was therefore not merely a judicial number, it was another tool by which the institution asserted that no expectation existed beyond its control. The chapter's terror lies less in spectacular cruelty than in the destruction of time. Prisoners survive by counting. Winters completed, years remaining, dates of eligibility, letters received, children growing older. The second term reveals that arithmetic itself is conditional. The state can take not only the prisoner's freedom, but his belief that suffering has a known limit. The second skin changes behavior even before any new accusation appears. A prisoner who knows that release can be canceled by a fresh case has less reason to believe good conduct will protect him. The administration gains the benefits of both certainty and uncertainty. The sentence is certain enough to compel obedience today, but uncertain enough that no future right can be claimed from it. A man with months remaining can be psychologically as vulnerable as a newcomer if security begins asking questions. Solzhenitsyn also emphasizes the grotesque theatricality of fabricated organizations. Investigators assign offices, leaders, military aims, and political programs to prisoners whose real common activity may have been eating at the same table or working in neighboring brigades. Once enough depositions exist, the paper organization acquires a solidity greater than the living relationships from which it was invented. A later reader of the file may see signatures and mutually confirming statements without seeing the hunger, threats, or isolation that produced them. A second term also destroys the ordinary meaning of legal rehabilitation. If a prisoner can be convicted for conduct manufactured inside the prison created by the first conviction, the institution can recursively generate its own evidence of danger. The longer someone remains inside, the more opportunities security has to interpret his adaptation to captivity as a new offense. The archipelago becomes self-replenishing not only through arrests from outside, but through renewed sentences imposed within. Chapter 14. Changing One's Fate. Against this indefinite captivity stands the oldest prisoner's fantasy, escape. Solzhenitsyn calls escape the green prosecutor, the only prosecutor who sometimes gives a prisoner the judgment he wants. An escape attempt asserts that the sentence is not a natural fact. The prisoner rejects the administration's claim to determine where his body must remain. Physically, opportunities could be surprisingly common. Camps required prisoners to work beyond the central zone in forests, fields, construction sites, rail lines, mines, and transport details. Wartime shortages reduced the number of guards in some places. A work party might be supervised by a single, tired convoy man. A truck could pass an open road. A prisoner could find himself in a village, on a riverbank, or several steps from unguarded forest. Yet most prisoners did not run. Solzhenitsyn is fascinated by the invisible barriers stronger than barbed wire, years of arrest, interrogation, punishment, and command train obedience. Hunger weakens the body needed for flight. A prisoner without documents cannot easily cross the Soviet landscape, buy a ticket, rent a room, or obtain regular work. His shaved head, camp clothing, accent, or unfamiliarity with the region can betray him. He may be thousands of kilometers from home in taiga, tundra, desert, or Arctic terrain, where geography itself functions as a guard. Family ties create another barrier. A fugitive who reaches home can expose relatives to interrogation or arrest. A man may therefore dream of escape, while knowing that the place he most wants to reach is the first place the police will watch. The state turns affection into part of the perimeter. Solzhenitsyn recounts episodes in which prisoners remain in place even after guards disappear temporarily. A convoy man fails to return, a door stands open, or a work party becomes momentarily unguarded, yet inmates wait. The habit of custody has moved inward. The story is not meant to mock them. It demonstrates how thoroughly institutions can train people to calculate danger according to the jailer's expectations. Successful escape requires more than courage. The fugitive needs food, clothing, direction, knowledge of transport, perhaps civilian papers or money, and enough physical strength to survive the first days. Experienced escape planners hoard bread, study maps, acquire tools, arrange signals, or learn the routes of work parties. Some disguise themselves as free workers. Others attempt enormous journeys through forests or along railways. Many are caught quickly, others starve or freeze. The punishment for recapture can be severe. Beatings, isolation, a penalty camp, a new criminal case, or years added to the term. This raises the apparent cost of failure, but does not eliminate attempts. For certain prisoners, the act itself becomes more important than the chance of success. To attempt escape is to refuse the internal conclusion that camp is the entire world. Solzhenitsyn therefore treats flight as a spiritual category as well as a logistical one. The person who remains can still change his fate inwardly by refusing to accept the moral authority of captivity. The fugitive makes the refusal physical. Even failed escapes expose the fact that the archipelago requires constant effort to keep people inside. Its borders are not laws of nature. They are human constructions enforced by guards, geography, hunger, documents, and fear. Escape stories therefore circulate through camp like folklore. A successful fugitive becomes evidence that the perimeter is not absolute. A captured fugitive becomes a warning about geography and documents. Experienced prisoners calculate distances to rail lines, seasons, rivers, villages, and the habits of local police. In remote northern regions, even the direction of travel can be uncertain, because a man may have arrived in sealed transport without knowing the route. The state has made ignorance of geography another security device. Some escapees seek freedom only long enough to settle personal business or see family, knowing recapture is likely. Others try to cross borders or disappear under false identities. Solzhenitsyn's interest is less in producing an escape manual than in the psychological difference between the man who accepts the camp's map and the man who redraws it in his head. The first sees forest as the wall beyond the wire. The second sees it as a possible road. The fugitives' stories also reveal the role of ordinary civilians. A villager may denounce a stranger out of fear or hope of reward. Another may secretly provide food or clothing. The escapee therefore encounters the same moral landscape as the prisoner inside camp. Institutions matter enormously, but individual choices remain unpredictable. A successful flight often depends on meeting someone willing to see a human being before seeing the category fugitive. Chapter 15. Punishments. A camp is already punishment, yet Gulag contains punishments inside punishment. Prisoners can be transferred to penalty barracks, punishment cells, special work details, stricter camp points, or entire penalty camps. The existence of these layers gives administrators a reserve of coercion beyond the sentence itself. Whatever conditions a prisoner has learned to endure, there is almost always somewhere worse he can be sent. The reasons vary. Escape attempts, refusal to work, religious resistance, fighting, theft, protest, possession of forbidden items, sexual conflict, refusal to become an informer, or simply the hostility of an official can bring additional punishment. Formal procedure offers little protection because camp administration controls both the accusation and the immediate conditions of confinement. Solzhenitsyn recounts the case of Irina Nagel, whose refusal to submit to sexual or security pressure contributed to transfer into harsher conditions. Women in penalty environments faced not only official brutality, but violence from criminal inmates. The administration could use the criminal hierarchy as another disciplinary instrument, knowing that a political or isolated prisoner placed among violent thieves might be punished without a guard laying a hand on her. Penalty camps often deliberately assembled the most difficult categories: escapees, stubborn religious believers, political resistors, criminals, and people already punished elsewhere. To make such a place function, authorities might insert a nucleus of physically strong ordinary workers expected to establish production. These supposedly normal prisoners soon discovered that they had been assigned to conditions designed for destruction. At Ravuchi, Solzhenitsyn describes an extreme labor regime. The workday, including marches, could consume most waking hours. Guards used dogs against people accused of lagging. Beatings supplemented hunger. A prisoner who failed the norm received a penalty ration that made future fulfillment even less possible. The familiar Gulag mechanism was intensified until the distance between labor discipline and slow execution became very small. Other sites acquired reputations through the domination of criminal groups. At the Vorkuta lime factory, prison hierarchy and violence made existence precarious even by camp standards. In the northern railway system after the war, accounts circulated of such hunger that cannibalism appeared. Solzhenitsyn includes the reports not as a lurid side story, but as the endpoint of a structure in which the state can repeatedly reduce the minimum conditions of human life while still calling the result correction through labor. Punishment also fragments solidarity. A prisoner deciding whether to protest a stolen ration or an abusive foreman knows that resistance may not improve his present camp, but instead move him to a place where no one knows him and conditions are worse. The administration can therefore discipline a large population with relatively selective transfers. Everyone understands what the penalty zone represents. The deeper lesson is that a sentence does not describe the amount of suffering imposed. Two people with identical terms can inhabit radically different worlds depending on work assignment, food category, climate, criminal hierarchy, health, and administrative favor. Camp punishment is elastic. It stretches downward whenever the authorities need another degree of force. The punishment cell reveals how deprivation can be subdivided almost indefinitely. A prisoner already underfed can be placed on a still smaller ration. A man already cold can be deprived of adequate clothing or bedding. A person already confined can be put into a smaller, darker, wetter space. The state does not need to invent fundamentally new forms of pain. It removes the narrow protections remaining within ordinary camp life. This makes formal legality nearly irrelevant to the prisoner's immediate existence. A court may have sentenced him to a fixed number of years, but a camp chief can alter the lived severity of those years through administrative classification. Punishment is therefore both centralized and intensely local. Moscow creates the institution. A commandant, guard, or security officer can decide how deeply one individual descends within it. The penalty system creates a threat that can be used without being applied to everyone. The reputation of a place such as Ravuchi travels through prisoner networks. A brigadier does not need to send every resistant worker there. The possibility can make many others obey. Camp administration thus multiplies force through information. Prisoners discipline themselves partly because they know the archipelago contains deeper levels they have not yet experienced. Chapter 16. The Socially Friendly. Solzhenitsyn devotes this chapter to the professional criminal caste, and to what he considers one of the Soviet penal system's most destructive ideological assumptions, the belief that habitual criminals were socially closer to the socialist order than political prisoners. Because thieves were imagined as products of class conditions rather than ideological enemies, they could be treated as potentially reformable. The Article 58 prisoner, by contrast, was defined by political hostility, and therefore remained suspect even when his actual conduct was harmless. This doctrine collided with camp reality. Solzhenitsyn rejects literary romanticization of thieves as rebellious folk heroes or Robin Hood figures. In camp, the professional criminal often directs violence downward toward people less able to resist: new prisoners, intellectuals, women, the sick, the elderly, and exhausted politicals. Clothing can be stripped from a dying man because the thief expects him not to need it tomorrow. Food parcels, boots, coats, and blankets become resources distributed by strength rather than law. The criminal code and camp administration reinforced these incentives. Offenses against state or socialist property could bring draconian punishment, while theft from private individuals might be regarded as less politically serious. The criminal learned that stealing from a fellow prisoner could be safer than touching state supplies. Thus, an ideology claiming to defend collective property helped make the individual unusually vulnerable. Guards often tolerated or exploited the arrangement. A criminal group capable of dominating a barracks reduced the administration's need to control every political prisoner directly. Thieves could enforce silence, seize better sleeping spaces, take food, and intimidate newcomers. The relationship did not always require an explicit bargain. A guard merely had to look away. The criminal world possessed its own rules, ranks, speech, gambling practices, and conceptions of honor. Traditional thieves rejected ordinary labor and cooperation with state authority as violations of their code. But the Soviet camp eventually produced a civil war inside that world. Criminals who had served in the army, worked for the administration, or otherwise broken the old code became known as bitches. Traditional thieves regarded them as traitors. The struggle between the two groups could turn camp barracks into battlefields. Knives, improvised weapons, ambushes, and revenge killings became common in some periods. The administration could manipulate transfers so enemies confronted one another, weakening both. Divide and rule operated inside the criminal caste, just as it did among political prisoners. Solzhenitsyn refuses to conclude that every ordinary criminal is irredeemable. Individuals differ, and some thieves show generosity or courage. His target is the sentimental doctrine that social origin makes criminal predation politically preferable to ideological descent. A regime that claims the political prisoner is uniquely dangerous ends by giving real predators a privileged position over people whose principal offense may have been speech, belief, nationality, or an invented conspiracy. The term socially friendly is therefore one of the archipelago's characteristic inversions. It describes not actual friendship toward society, but ideological classification. The practical effect is to empower a caste whose violence helps maintain the prison order. The struggle between thieves and bitches also shows how camp authority can turn a code of resistance into another source of control. Traditional thieves claim honor by refusing official work and cooperation, but that refusal leaves them dependent on extracting resources from other prisoners. Collaborating criminals gain administrative support, but become targets of criminal revenge. By transferring groups strategically and tolerating violence, camp officials can make each side weaken the other. Solzhenitsyn's broader objection is to political sociology masquerading as moral judgment. A peasant sentenced for a handful of grain or a believer sentenced for worship can be labeled socially dangerous, while a violent repeat thief is described as socially near. The classification tells the reader more about the regime's priorities than about the actual threat each prisoner presents to another human being. The criminal caste also demonstrates how a prison society can invert ordinary concepts of status. A man admired among thieves may be precisely the person most dangerous to weaker prisoners. Courage and resisting guards can coexist with cruelty toward cellmates. Solzhenitsyn distrusts any moral system that mistakes opposition to authority for virtue by itself. The relevant question remains what a person does with power when he possesses it, even if that power exists only over another starving prisoner. Chapter 17. The Kids. Children occupy a particularly disturbing place in Solzhenitsyn's account because Soviet ideology celebrated the new state's responsibility for educating and protecting youth. The camp and orphanage system reveals another reality. Juvenile crime, homelessness, the children of arrested parents, and politically accused minors all enter institutions where punishment can reproduce the behavior it claims to cure. The state lowered the age at which serious criminal responsibility could be imposed, and even political provisions could reach remarkably young people. A child could be punished for theft born of hunger, for joining older street children, for a political joke, for a school group, or for resistance to the institutions that had already separated him from his family. Children of prisoners faced consequences without being accused of personal crimes. When parents were arrested, sons and daughters could be sent to state homes, separated from siblings, moved across the country, and encouraged or forced to abandon family identity. They learned quickly that mentioning a condemned parent could be dangerous. The punishment of the adult radiated into the next generation. Solzhenitsyn recounts women who protested what was happening to dispossessed peasant children during collectivization, and were themselves drawn into repression. Vera Inchik, for example, objected to the abandonment and suffering of children from families labeled kulaks. Compassion toward people defined as class enemies could itself become politically suspicious. The story of Galia Benedictova shows how thoroughly arrest can reorganize a child's life. Parents disappear, institutional authorities replace family, and the child is pressured to accept official interpretations of what happened. Abuse inside orphanages adds another layer. The state presents itself as rescuer, while the child experiences it as the force that removed the people to whom she belonged. School children could also become direct political defendants. Solzhenitsyn describes Nina Peregod, punished after writing an anti-war or politically unacceptable rhyme while still young. The disproportion between the childish act and the camp sentence illustrates the logic already seen throughout the archipelago. Once behavior is assigned political meaning, age and practical danger can become secondary. Zoya Lishcheva provides an even more extraordinary case. Raised in a religious family repeatedly struck by arrest, she refused to surrender the cross she wore, and was sent into institutions that classified her as difficult or backward. She resisted authority with theatrical defiance. At one orphanage she participated in or organized the defacement of a Stalin monument and openly admitted responsibility. Her age prevented the harshest formal penalty, but she received a long-term and later further punishment. Solzhenitsyn does not idealize all juvenile prisoners. Camp and colony life can make them cruel, sexually aggressive, thieving, and skilled in deception. But this is exactly his accusation against the system. Institutions presented as places of socialist re-education often gather damaged children together under older criminals, violence, scarcity, and arbitrary discipline. Instead of restoring a social bond, they teach the techniques of survival in a predatory hierarchy. The children expose the false boundary between correction and inheritance. The state claims that guilt is individual, yet a parent's political classification can reshape a child's entire existence. It claims to educate, yet its institutions can train violence. It claims to build the future, yet it makes the future generation answer for conflicts it did not create. Juvenile institutions also teach children the language of power very early. The clever child learns which adult can be deceived, what property can be stolen, how to form groups, and when violence carries little consequence. An orphanage or colony that lacks stable affection and credible justice can create exactly the antisocial behavior later used to justify harsher discipline. Re-education becomes self-confirming. The institution damages the child and then points to the damage as proof that the child required the institution. The political child is still more revealing because the concept of dangerous intention becomes almost absurd. A school rhyme, cross, leaflet, or vandalized monument cannot plausibly threaten a state with armies and police. Yet punishment teaches every other child who hears the story that political symbols are surrounded by exceptional force. The smallness of the offender can therefore increase rather than reduce the pedagogical value of repression. Solzhenitsyn's stories of children also reinforce his argument about memory. A child whose parents vanish may receive an official biography designed to sever the link with them. Names, family history, and religious practice can all be altered. Repression, therefore, attacks not only the present household, but the transmission of memory between generations. Preserving the story of a parent becomes a quiet form of resistance to the state's attempt to redefine the family through political classification. Chapter 18. The Muses in Gulag. Even the archipelago maintains cultural departments. The Cultural Educational Section, usually known by its initials, is supposed to re-educate prisoners through lectures, newspapers, performances, competitions, slogans, literacy work, and political instruction. Solzhenitsyn treats the official claim with contempt. He doubts that the machinery ever truly remade an adult prisoner into the ideologically improved person described in reports. Much of its activity exists for paperwork and propaganda. Cultural workers organize wall newspapers, production campaigns, anti-religious talks, amateur ensembles, shock worker celebrations, and speeches praising labor. The absurdity becomes clearest when propaganda brigades are sent to entertain men already exhausted by penalty work. Songs about joyful construction are performed before people who experience construction as hunger and compulsion. The cultural section also lies close to security. A person capable of writing, organizing meetings, or learning what prisoners think is useful to more than one department. Intellectual life conducted under official sponsorship can therefore become another source of observation and reporting. Even the apparently harmless world of theater and poetry is not outside the surveillance structure. Yet genuine art persists independently of this machinery. Prisoners compose poems without paper and memorize one another's verses. Musicians perform with whatever instruments exist. Actors reconstruct plays. Scientists and intellectuals lecture informally. The camp cannot fully eliminate the need to create, and the absence of ordinary possessions can make memory itself an archive. Camp theaters occupy an especially ambiguous position. A chief with access to talented prisoners can assemble singers, actors, dancers, musicians, painters, and stage technicians, and create performances for officials and free employees. Famous artists become another form of camp property. A performer may receive better food and avoid logging, but the privilege depends on pleasing administrators whose power over her remains absolute. Solzhenitsyn describes musicians and actors moved between camps because an official wants a particular voice or performance. Couples can be separated by transfer. An artist judged insufficiently useful can be sent back toward general labor. The theater therefore saves some bodies while reminding everyone that talent, like engineering knowledge, is valued only insofar as the administration can consume it. He recounts cases in which a camp's artistic world is almost luxurious compared with surrounding barracks. Costumes, rehearsals, orchestras, decorated stages, and audiences of officials. Behind that surface stand hungry prisoners, coercive work, and the knowledge that the performer cannot simply leave. The contrast resembles the broader Soviet achievement Solzhenitsyn will discuss later. Cultural sophistication and technological accomplishment can coexist with primitive domination of the people producing them. Solzhenitsyn includes himself in the moral discomfort. At one point, he participates in amateur performances for a drunken officer. Years later, he remembers not artistic fulfillment, but humiliation, the prisoner using his intelligence to entertain someone who possesses power over him. Survival can make almost any activity attractive, yet retrospective freedom changes its meaning. The muses of Gulag therefore have two faces. Official culture turns art into propaganda and administrative ornament. Unofficial culture allows prisoners to preserve memory, imagination, humor, dignity, and contact with worlds beyond the wire. The same poem can be a line in a wall newspaper, or an act of inward freedom. The difference lies in whether creation serves the machinery or preserves something the machinery cannot own. The prisoner's art also preserves identities that official classification tries to erase. A scientist can remain a scientist by explaining a problem to another prisoner. A poet can remain a poet by composing lines that exist only in memory. A musician can recognize another musician through a half-destroyed instrument. these acts do not change the sentence, but they resist the reduction of a person to labor category and file number. At the same time, artistic privilege can produce its own moral unease. The performer who receives better rations knows that a place in the ensemble may mean another prisoner takes the hard work. The actor who entertains camp officials survives, because the same authority that starves others enjoys theater. Solzhenitsyn refuses the easy conclusion that such artists should have chosen death instead. His point is that Gulag turns even beauty into a compromised resource, forcing people to seek life through institutions they despise. This is why remembered art matters so much in Solzhenitsyn's own project. The Gulag often denies prisoners paper, archives, privacy, and stable possession, yet verses, melodies, anecdotes, and biographies survive by being carried in people. The archipelago attempted to make human beings interchangeable labor units. Memory preserves precisely the particularity that such accounting erases. Chapter 19. The Sikhs as a Nation. After describing the camp's occupations, hierarchies, punishments, children, and culture, Solzhenitsyn pauses for a satirical exercise in ethnography. If Soviet theory defines a nation through common territory, economic life, language, and psychological characteristics expressed in culture, then the prisoners of the archipelago begin to look like a nation of their own. The joke is serious because long confinement really does create a social world distinct from the country outside. The territory is scattered rather than continuous, but its islands are linked by convoy routes, transit prisons, regulations, and administrative habits. A prisoner transferred from one region to another recognizes much of the new camp immediately. The barracks differ, climates differ, and local chiefs differ, yet the same counts, searches, work norms, ration hierarchies, informers, trustees, thieves, and security practices make the places intelligible to one another. Economic life is equally distinctive. The Sikhs' economy is built around bread, tobacco, clothing, work assignments, favors, parcels, stolen supplies, and the narrow opportunities created by camp labor. Objects acquire values radically different from those in freedom. A spoon can be essential property. A piece of cloth may become footwear. A few grams of food can purchase assistance. A protected job may be worth more than money because it preserves strength. The prisoner's psychological world also changes. National origin remains important, especially among groups recently deported or prisoners who share language and religion, but camp experience cuts across those divisions. A Russian officer, Lithuanian nationalist, Ukrainian peasant, Jewish engineer, priest, Central Asian villager, and German civilian can all learn the same reflexes: protect bread, distrust the informer, fear the work assignment, read the count, interpret the guard's mood, and understand what it means when someone is becoming a last-legger. Language registers this common experience. Prison slang supplies words for prisoners, guards, informers, food, searches, work, punishment, criminal castes, and the endless improvisations of survival. Some expressions come from thieves, others from bureaucratic abbreviations, still others from the distortion of official terminology. The word Sikh itself grows from an administrative abbreviation for prisoner and becomes a human identity more powerful than the file number that produced it. Solzhenitsyn notes that camp language eventually leaks outward. Men and women return from prison or exile. Guards and free workers carry expressions home. Whole towns grow beside camps. Words created behind barbed wire begin to appear in ordinary Soviet speech. The linguistic boundary between archipelago and mainland becomes as porous as the social one. The satire also mocks the state's obsession with defining collective identities scientifically, while it inadvertently manufactures one through coercion. Prisoners are torn from previous communities and concentrated in a system that gives them common conditions, common enemies, common knowledge, and common language. Gulag tries to atomize them, yet the very uniformity of repression creates recognizable cultural bonds. This does not mean the Sikhs form a harmonious nation. Criminals prey on politicals, national groups quarrel, trustees exploit laborers, loyalists despise oppositionists, informers betray cellmates, and hunger breaks solidarity. The shared culture is the culture of a damaged society. But precisely because the divisions occur within a common institutional world, Solzhenitsyn can describe that world as a nation with bitter comic accuracy. The national metaphor also captures the way previous identities can be preserved and transformed simultaneously. Deportees and political groups may cling fiercely to language, religion, or homeland. Because those attachments offer solidarity the camp cannot supply. Yet even the strongest national group has to learn the common technologies of camp existence. Lithuanian, Russian, Ukrainian, Jewish, German, and Central Asian prisoners can misunderstand one another politically, while understanding perfectly what a punishment ration, a search, a convoy command, or a dangerous work assignment means. Gulag produces a shared, practical vocabulary without erasing the histories that brought people into it. Solzhenitsyn's satire, therefore, contains a historical warning. If millions of citizens spend years inside a separate institutional culture, that culture will not vanish when they cross the gate. Former prisoners carry its language and reflexes home. So do guards, administrators, and civilian workers. The Czech nation is temporary in legal status, but capable of leaving permanent marks on the larger nation that created it. The prisoner's common culture also changes his relation to official Soviet language. Phrases about correction, shock work, vigilance, socially useful labor, and enemies acquire meanings opposite to their printed ones. A newcomer may initially hear them literally. A veteran hears the practical consequences underneath. This double language becomes another national characteristic of the Zeeks. Understanding what an official word usually means once translated into food, punishment, work, or danger. Chapter 20. The Dogs. Service. Solzhenitsyn now turns to the men on the other side of the barbed wire, camp officers, convoy troops, guards, and the literal service dogs trained to pursue prisoners. He asks a question that parallels his earlier discussion of interrogators. What kind of person becomes capable of guarding hungry, exhausted people year after year, and what does the institution do to those who enter it without unusual cruelty? Selection matters. A system that rewards hardness and treats pity as weakness gradually promotes certain traits. A guard who allows a prisoner to rest, overlooks a minor violation, or questions an order risks discipline. A guard who shouts, strikes, reports, or shoots can defend himself by pointing to regulations. Over time, the occupational norm moves towards severity, even if not every recruit begins there. Power also changes perspective. A low-ranking guard may be poor, badly educated, and himself subject to military discipline. Yet inside the zone he possesses authority over professors, officers, engineers, peasants, priests, and older men. He decides whether they can cross a line, stop work, visit a toilet, or approach a fence. The rifle makes social distinctions from the free world irrelevant. The dogs embody the logic in concentrated form. Trained to pursue escapees and intimidate work columns, they are innocent animals shaped for a human purpose. Solzhenitsyn's title extends that metaphor to the institution itself. Service can train human beings too. Cruel acts become duties, and duties acquire moral protection because they are performed on behalf of the state. He recounts incidents in which guards prefer the security of the perimeter to the lives inside it. If fire breaks out, opening a gate can create an escape risk. If a prisoner crosses a prohibited line, regulations may authorize shooting, even when no genuine escape is underway. Institutional responsibility encourages the guard to fear the consequences of mercy more than the consequences of killing. The camp guard population itself was often drawn from young recruits and people sent far from home. National minorities or rural conscripts could be placed in regions where they had little connection with prisoners or local society. Training supplied the political explanation. The men behind the wire were enemies, traitors, fascists, or criminals whose suffering resulted from their own acts. War disrupted this system by draining manpower. With experienced guards sent elsewhere, some camps relied on weaker supervision and on prisoners themselves. Solzhenitsyn remembers guards who behaved almost humanely, speaking with prisoners, allowing small freedoms, or refusing to intensify suffering unnecessarily. In rare cases, emotional relationships cross the institutional line. Such episodes matter because they demonstrate that cruelty is encouraged but not biologically inevitable. The most revealing adaptation is self-guarding, in which selected prisoners are armed or given authority to guard other prisoners. The system turns the captive population into part of its own perimeter. Some prisoner guards become especially brutal because their privilege depends on demonstrating loyalty. They may fear return to ordinary camp more than free guards feared disciplinary punishment. Yet even here Solzhenitsyn finds individual conscience. Men such as Kuzma or Lunin can be torn between the advantages of the assignment and recognition that they are helping imprison people like themselves. The conflict reinforces the book's recurring moral argument. Institutions create incentives, but they do not completely abolish personal choice. The campkeeper, therefore, cannot be explained only by ideology or sadism. Poverty, career, military obedience, fear, habit, and the gradual normalization of power all contribute. Gulag is sustained not merely by a handful of monsters, but by thousands of people performing specialized tasks. The dog's service is the process through which guarding other human beings becomes an occupation. The guard's moral insulation is strengthened by the prisoner's classification. A rifleman does not have to know the biography of each person in the column. He knows the category supplied by authority. If the men are enemies, traitors, or dangerous criminals, harsh treatment can appear not merely permitted but responsible. The label saves the guard from repeatedly asking whether a sick old man or exhausted woman in front of him personally deserves what is happening. Bureaucratic language performs moral labor for the individual. At the same time, camp service could be unattractive and difficult for the guards themselves. Isolation, climate, military discipline, low cultural horizons, and distance from home shape their lives. Solzhenitsyn includes this, not to equate their condition with the prisoners, but to explain how a coercive institution recruits from ordinary social material. The guard may be only one step above poverty and subordination, yet the presence of people still lower gives him a compensating sense of authority. Solzhenitsyn refuses the excuse that a guard has no moral agency because an order stands behind him. The camp depends precisely on thousands of individual acts that can be made slightly harsher or slightly more humane. A guard may not be able to open the gates, but he can choose whether to strike a lagging prisoner, steal a parcel, report a trivial violation, or allow an exhausted man a moment's rest. Small choices do not abolish the system, yet they reveal whether the person has surrendered judgment entirely to his role. Chapter 21. Campside. The archipelago does not stop at the barbed wire. Every large camp creates a surrounding social zone, populated by guards, administrators, families, free employees, released prisoners who are forbidden to leave the region, exiles, engineers, doctors, supply workers, and people attracted by northern wages or unusual opportunities. Solzhenitsyn calls this campside world a transmission belt through which camp customs pass into ordinary Soviet society. Many important Soviet towns grew in close relationship with forced labor. Magadan, Vorkuta, Norilsk, Dudinka, Karaganda, and other settlements cannot be separated cleanly from the camps that built, supplied, or surrounded them. Streets occupied by free residents may stand beside compounds where prisoners perform the heavy labor supporting the same local economy. The free workers living in such places do not form a single moral category. Some exploit prisoners openly. A free foreman may take credit for a Zik engineer's technical solution. A clerk may manipulate production records. Officials use prisoner servants, tailors, performers, craftsmen, or drivers. Access to a captive labor force allows ordinary privileges to expand into forms of domination unavailable elsewhere. Others help. A civilian worker may carry a secret letter to a prisoner's family, bring food, exchange news, or conceal a small violation. Some become drinking companions or lovers of prisoners. The same porous boundary that allows exploitation also allows sympathy. A person living beside the zone can learn to see the Zik not as the political category printed in his file, but as a neighbor separated by a fence. Crime and corruption circulate across the boundary too. Prisoners and free workers steal state materials together, falsify accounts, exchange goods, and collaborate in black markets. Camp production depends so heavily on deception that the moral habits of the zone become economically useful outside it. A free employee learns the same skill as the prisoner, say what the plan requires on paper, and solve reality by unofficial means. Families grow up in this environment. Children of guards and administrators hear camp slang, see columns of prisoners, and absorb assumptions about who deserves command and who deserves obedience. Former prisoners released into restricted settlement carry their own habits. A town can therefore become socially shaped by incarceration, even when most residents are technically free. Solzhenitsyn's argument widens from local corruption to national culture. Secrecy, distrust, informer psychology, administrative arbitrariness, contempt for weak people, and dependence on privilege do not remain inside prison because the people who practice them move back and forth across the wire. The camp is part of the same society rather than a sealed institution imposed from another world. Campside thus prepares the transition into Part 4. If the archipelago can affect people who never serve a sentence, then the moral question is no longer what imprisonment does only to prisoners. It is what a society becomes when millions live in the presence of coercive institutions and learn to adapt to them. Campside also produces a peculiar social mobility. A former prisoner released into restricted settlement may become a skilled employee because the region lacks free specialists. A free newcomer may discover that the best engineer in the district still lives under administrative restriction. A camp officer's family may depend on prisoner-built housing and prisoner-produced goods while considering the prisoners morally inferior. The categories of enemy and useful worker coexist without being reconciled. This is one reason Solzhenitsyn treats Gulag as more than a set of penal institutions. Around each large camp grows a mixed economy of coercion and ordinary life. The school, shop, apartment, mine office, theater, and prison zone share roads and supplies. The free town may literally stand on foundations laid by prisoners. Social memory then becomes difficult. Later residents can inherit the city without knowing or wanting to know who cleared the forest, dug the trench, or died during construction. The contagion of campsite culture also works upward through administration. Officials who learn to solve shortages with prisoner labor can carry the habit into new enterprises. Managers who become accustomed to falsified worksheets may later regard manipulated statistics as normal management. The camp is therefore not simply influenced by Soviet bureaucracy. It trains a particular kind of Soviet bureaucracy in return. The border is permeable in both directions. Chapter 22. We are building. Part 3 ends by confronting the material legacy of forced labor. Gulag was not only an apparatus of repression. It was woven into Soviet construction, extraction, transport, forestry, mining, agriculture, and strategic industry. Solzhenitsyn lists projects across the country to show that camp labor cannot be treated as an isolated economic curiosity. Prisoners helped build a visible portion of the Soviet state. The official image was heroic construction. Posters, camp newspapers, and histories celebrated canals, railways, mines, hydroelectric facilities, cities, industrial complexes, roads, ports, state farms, and wartime production. The prisoner became a builder of socialism. Solzhenitsyn does not deny that real structures were built. His attack is on the price, quality, and mythology surrounding them. Camp construction combines immense manpower with chronic shortages and managerial irrationality. A project may possess thousands of prisoners but lack the correct tools, seasoned timber, spare parts, transport, skilled supervisors, or time. The planned economy then demands completion anyway. Engineers and prisoners improvise machines, reuse discarded materials, steal supplies from neighboring organizations, and invent substitutes simply to keep work moving. Solzhenitsyn recounts workshops where prisoners produce equipment that had not been available through normal channels. Technical ingenuity can be astonishing. Men officially classified as enemies solve engineering problems on which state projects depend. The achievement is real, but it occurs under the contradiction already seen with trustees and specialist prisoners. The state distrusts the person politically while depending on his intelligence economically. Speed often defeats quality. Buildings rise from wet or unseasoned materials, foundations are rushed, and production norms reward visible completion more than long durability. Solzhenitsyn contrasts older structures that survived for generations with newer work that rotted or failed quickly. Forced labor can make an enormous quantity of effort available, but it cannot repeal engineering reality. The propaganda surrounding projects frequently erases the prisoners themselves. A canal becomes an achievement of the state. A railway becomes a triumph of planning. A new Arctic city appears as evidence of heroic development. The people who dug, carried, froze, starved, and died disappear into the finished object. Solzhenitsyn's purpose in listing projects is to return human labor to the material map. The list is deliberately overwhelming. He invokes the White Sea Baltic Canal, the Moscow-Volga and Volga-Don waterways, northern rail lines, mining districts, hydroelectric construction, chemical and metallurgical plants, timber operations, state farms, roads, ports, wartime factories, coal fields, gold extraction, uranium and other strategic minerals, and cities that grew around camp complexes. No single project defines Gulag because the labor network was dispersed across the entire economy. The final image compresses the contradiction. The Soviet Union has launched Sputnik into orbit, a genuine technological achievement capable of astonishing the world. Outside Solzhenitsyn's window, however, women in prisoner clothing still carry building material by hand under primitive conditions. Advanced science and archaic coercion occupy the same historical moment. For Solzhenitsyn, the fact that something impressive was built cannot settle the moral account. A pyramid remains physically impressive even if slaves carried the stone. Nor is forced labor necessarily economically efficient merely because prisoners are unpaid. Starvation, wasted lives, falsified production, poor construction, security costs, and lost human talent are costs hidden by accounting. Part 3, therefore, ends with a challenge to the language of achievement. Yes, the archipelago built. The question is, what kind of civilization counts only the finished canal, mine, city, or satellite, and refuses to count the human beings consumed in producing the conditions around it? The catalog of construction also makes clear that forced labor was especially attractive for projects in remote environments. Free workers would have demanded high wages, housing, transport, and some ability to leave. Prisoners could be delivered under convoy and retained regardless of climate. The camp therefore helped the state colonize resource frontiers whose human cost would otherwise have appeared directly in wages and voluntary migration. The map of economic expansion and the map of the archipelago overlap for structural reasons, yet the same coercion could lower productivity. A starving man has little incentive to preserve tools or materials for a future he may never see. A prisoner who knows a project is badly designed cannot safely challenge superiors. Managers report what the plan demands. Solzhenitsyn's account, therefore, resists both simple claims. Forced labor did build major works, but the existence of those works does not prove that the method was efficient or necessary. One must compare not only visible output, but the alternatives never attempted and the human capacity destroyed in the process. Solzhenitsyn also stresses the opportunity cost hidden behind the monumental list. A scientist sent to logging is not only a laborer acquired cheaply, he is scientific work lost. A farmer deported to a northern project leaves land and local knowledge behind. Families are broken, children grow without parents, and skilled people spend years solving the problem of camp survival instead of the problems for which society trained them. None of these losses appears on the plaque attached to a finished dam or factory. Part 4. The Soul and Barbed Wire. Chapter 1. The Ascent. After hundreds of pages describing institutions designed to degrade human beings, Solzhenitsyn turns inward. The question of Part 4 is what happens to the soul inside barbed wire? Does imprisonment merely corrupt, or can suffering produce moral development? He begins cautiously, because he knows that millions died without receiving any redemptive lesson, and that the camps were not created for spiritual improvement. Yet his own life compels him to ask whether captivity changed him in ways freedom had not. Prison provides one resource in abundance: time to think. The free person is pulled among work, ambition, possessions, family obligations, entertainment, status, and practical plans. The prisoner loses nearly all of these. He may be physically exhausted, but when thought remains possible, it repeatedly returns to the same questions. Why am I here? Who is responsible? What have I done with my life? And what remains mine when everything external has been taken? The first response is usually self-righteousness. Political prisoners know that their legal accusations are often false or grotesquely disproportionate. A person tortured into confessing espionage he never committed, quite reasonably, sees himself as innocent. Solzhenitsyn did too. He blamed interrogators, Stalin, the security organs, informers, judges, and the political system. All deserved judgment, but complete concentration on their guilt left one question untouched. Was legal innocence the same as moral innocence? Camp slowly complicated that answer. Solzhenitsyn remembered his behavior before arrest, especially as a Soviet officer. Rank had fed vanity. He had enjoyed privileges without examining them closely. He could be harsh towards subordinates, confident in his intelligence, and impatient with people beneath him. Political belief had allowed him to divide human beings into morally simplified categories. His arrest was unjust, but injustice done to him did not erase injustices he had done or ignored. The decisive encounter comes through Boris Kornfeld, a prison doctor of Jewish background who had converted to Christianity. Kornfeld had begun to see his life through a moral framework radically different from the ideology around him. In conversation with Solzhenitsyn, he described the discovery that even when a particular punishment is unjust, a person who examines his whole life may find moral debts he had previously refused to see. This was not an argument that the state had a right to torture innocent people. It was an argument that the victim's innocence before the indictment did not make him morally perfect. Kornfeld spoke at length one night. By morning, he had been attacked in the ward and killed with a plasterer's mallet. Solzhenitsyn received the conversation almost as a final testament. The doctor's murder gave unusual force to a thought that would become central to his writing. Moral judgment cannot be organized simply by separating humanity into a good camp and an evil camp. From this develops his famous conclusion that the line dividing good and evil passes through every human heart. If evil belonged only to a visible class of villains, society could identify and destroy them. But the same person is capable of generosity and cruelty under different circumstances. Political revolutions make a catastrophic error when they imagine evil can be eliminated by removing its supposed social carriers. Nobles, bourgeois, kulaks, priests, oppositionists, traitors, or any other category. The violence used to destroy them produces new evil in the destroyers. Religious traditions, Solzhenitsyn argues, understood the struggle differently because they locate evil within the individual and demand inward judgment. This insight does not absolve institutions. On the contrary, an institution that rewards cruelty is especially dangerous precisely because ordinary people contain the capacity to become cruel. Political structure and personal conscience meet in every order obeyed, every denunciation written, every prisoner struck, and every small mercy offered. Solzhenitsyn begins to reinterpret suffering itself. He does not praise hunger, torture, or forced labor. He says instead that suffering can strip away illusions if a person refuses merely to become bitter. The loss of property teaches how little property can matter. The collapse of ambition reveals the vanity of advancement. The presence of death reduces many former anxieties to their true scale. A prisoner can discover that the one realm the camp cannot completely command is the moral meaning he gives his own actions. This produces the astonishing gratitude with which Solzhenitsyn looks backward on imprisonment. He can say, in effect, "Bless you, prison," because prison helped destroy the arrogance of the man he had been. The statement is deliberately personal. It cannot justify imprisoning anyone else. Kornfeld was murdered. Countless prisoners were broken. Children were orphaned. Lives were wasted. The moral possibility of ascent belongs to the prisoner, not to the jailer who created the suffering. The chapter, therefore, marks a fundamental change of scale. Part 3 asks how the camp system functions. Part 4 asks what remains after every external structure has been turned against the individual. Solzhenitsyn's answer is not freedom in the ordinary sense. It is the possibility, fragile and never guaranteed, that a person can use suffering to judge himself more severely than his enemies and thereby recover an inner freedom the sentence was not designed to grant. The ascent is also an argument about judgment. Solzhenitsyn no longer wants to explain history only by identifying bad rulers and innocent subjects. The state can be criminal and the victim still capable of moral failure. These propositions do not cancel one another. Recognizing one's own wrongdoing does not validate a false indictment. It prevents opposition to injustice from becoming another ideology of personal innocence. That distinction allows him to condemn Gulag without making prisoners saints. Some prisoners inform, steal, exploit, or beat others. Some guards show mercy. Some loyalists suffer nobly. Some dissidents act selfishly. The line through the heart changes the scale of analysis from class categories to individual decisions. For Solzhenitsyn, this is precisely the moral lesson totalizing ideologies resist, because they justify coercion by assigning virtue and guilt collectively. Kornfeld's fate keeps Solzhenitsyn from converting spiritual discovery into optimism. The man who articulates a moral insight is murdered almost immediately. The camp does not reward assent. It may destroy the person who assents. That is why the lesson must be carried by someone else. Moral growth is not a hidden mechanism through which historical suffering becomes justified. It is a human possibility that sometimes survives despite the historical crime. This distinction is essential to the volume's architecture. After showing how institutions can shape conduct downward through hunger and power, Solzhenitsyn shows that they cannot make the human person completely predictable. The same pressure produces betrayal in one person, endurance in another, conversion in a third, and moral confusion in a fourth. The barbed wire controls movement more reliably than it controls the soul. By placing the moral ascent chapter immediately after the economic and social anatomy of camp, Solzhenitsyn also changes what the word freedom means. Political freedom has clearly been destroyed, yet he begins to identify a narrower freedom in the interval between pressure and response. The state can make hunger likely, punishment immediate, and obedience advantageous, but it cannot guarantee that every prisoner will betray a friend, or that every guard will choose cruelty. That residue of choice is small enough not to romanticize the camp, and large enough to preserve moral responsibility. The idea also prepares the argument of the remaining chapters. If inner freedom exists, then corruption must be examined honestly rather than denied. If the barbed wire does not determine the soul completely, neither can the free mainland claim innocence merely because most citizens sleep outside the zone. Solzhenitsyn will move from individual ascent to individual degradation, and then back outward to the society whose habits made both the camp and its surrounding silence possible. Chapter 2, or Corruption. Immediately after describing the possibility of spiritual ascent, Solzhenitsyn stops himself and gives the opposing case its full force. Varlam Shalamov, whose own camp experience produced some of the bleakest writing about Kolyma, rejected any sentimental idea that camp ennobles. In his judgment, the camp was constructed precisely to destroy the human personality. Extreme hunger and fear do not automatically deepen character. They can strip away friendship, generosity, pride, love, and intellectual interest until anger and animal calculation remain. Solzhenitsyn accepts the distinction between prison and camp that Shalamov and Yevgenia Ginsburg emphasize. A prisoner in a cell, even under severe confinement, may have time to confront grief directly. He can reflect, speak with another prisoner, examine memory, and conduct the moral duel described in the previous chapter. Camp labor changes the conditions. Bread is not simply given, it is attached to production. To eat, a prisoner must compete for work, rations, protected assignments, and physical survival. The result is envy. A man can envy someone released under an amnesty rather than rejoice for him. A prisoner serving 20 years can resent those serving 10. Later, when categories reverse and political prisoners begin to leave while ordinary criminals remain, the criminals can resent the politicals. Scarcity makes another person's good fortune feel like one's own loss. Fear produces the same narrowing. A prisoner worries about losing a relatively tolerable job, being transferred to general labor, landing in a punishment camp, being robbed during transport, or receiving a new term. He may strike someone weaker because he himself is weak before the administration. Solzhenitsyn uses the phrase soul mange for the rapid decay of character under constant external pressure. The camp deliberately makes prisoners instruments of one another's suffering. In one example, a mentally disturbed woman named Moisyavite wanders away looking for her mother. The administration ties her near the gate and announces that because of her supposed escape attempt, the whole camp will lose its next rest day. Returning work brigades spit at and strike the bound woman, blaming her rather than the officials who invented the collective punishment. She only smiles. The system has redirected resentment downward. The work assigner's position offers another path to corruption. A prisoner who has endured years of logging may finally be offered the chance to assign other people to work. The temptation is enormous. Solzhenitsyn recounts a respected lumberjack who accepts such a position for only months and later remembers those months as morally heavier than the years in which he suffered himself. Men died under assignments he helped impose. The soft job saved his body while burdening his memory. Self-guarding produces the contradiction in its most literal form. A prisoner accepts a rifle, a better ration, and the title of comrade in exchange for guarding other prisoners. He has been imprisoned, uprooted, and humiliated, yet is offered a position above people sharing the same condition. Some prisoner guards become harsher than free guards because their privilege is precarious and must be continually demonstrated. Solzhenitsyn, therefore, does not retract the previous chapter, but he refuses to universalize it. Suffering may provide the occasion for moral ascent. it can also provide the conditions for degradation. Camp overwhelmingly pushes toward degradation because its economy is built on scarcity, competition, fear, and unequal access to survival. If someone rises morally there, he does so against the structure, not because the structure is benevolent. The two chapters must be read together. To say that Solzhenitsyn learned in prison is not to say that prison was a school society had a right to create. The possibility of inner growth belongs to the victim. The responsibility for creating conditions designed to corrupt remains with those who built and maintained them. Chapter 3. Our Muzzled Freedom. Solzhenitsyn now removes the barbed wire as an analytical boundary. The archipelago, he argues, is like a tumor within the Soviet body, but a tumor that sends its influence through the whole organism. People who never enter a camp still learn habits produced by the same system: fear, secrecy, servility, informing, bureaucratic dependence, and the refusal to see what happens to arrested neighbors. The first great school is fear. Arrest can arrive at night without warning. A person knows colleagues, relatives, or neighbors who have disappeared. The safest response is to detach from them immediately. Friendship with the accused becomes suspicious. Visiting the family may be dangerous. Asking questions can attract attention. The state does not need to arrest everyone if the possibility of arrest teaches everyone how to behave. This fear is reinforced by practical dependence. Employment, residence permits, housing, internal passports, education, promotion, and access to ordinary opportunities are controlled through institutions that ask about social origin, relatives, previous arrests, time spent under occupation, and innumerable biographical details. A person learns that his official biography is not merely a description of life, but a political document whose wrong entry can shape the future. Secrecy becomes another habit. Institutions conceal information from citizens and from one another. Families of prisoners often cannot learn where a relative has been taken, whether a sentence has been imposed, or whether the person is alive. Formulas such as no right of correspondence can hide execution. People become accustomed to the idea that the most consequential facts in their own lives belong to the state rather than to them. Ignorance follows. Citizens receive official accounts of enemies, trials, production, foreign affairs, and social conditions, while contradictory evidence remains fragmented into private experience. One person knows an innocent engineer who was arrested. Another knows a peasant family exiled. Another has heard from a returned prisoner. Because open comparison is dangerous, these fragments do not easily become common knowledge. Each person can believe his own case is exceptional. Informing penetrates free society in the same way it penetrates camp. A colleague, neighbor, student, employee, or acquaintance can be recruited. The informer may be motivated by belief, fear, revenge, ambition, or minor privilege. The practical result is self-censorship. People learn to speak differently at home, at work, in public, and in front of children. The damage reaches families. Wives of arrested men stand in prison queues with parcels and inquiries, often receiving no useful answer. Children are instructed not to speak about a father. Housing can be lost, careers blocked, and relatives marked by association. Solzhenitsyn reproduces the heartbreaking logic of children who do not understand the disappearance. A small boy can write to his father as if the man were merely away in a hospital and ask him to come home, while adults around the child know that prison, exile, or death may be the reality. Solzhenitsyn is especially bitter toward public moral posturing that condemns repression abroad while remaining silent about Soviet prisoners. Writers and officials can denounce the imprisonment of political opponents in another country because doing so serves policy, while millions of domestic cases are excluded from respectable discussion. Humanitarian language becomes selective enough to protect the system using it. Camp symbols also enter public space. Guards with dogs, prison slang, convoy practices, and the celebration of security institutions become familiar parts of social imagination. The population learns to view force as normal. The barrier between citizen and prisoner is psychologically thin. Almost anyone can cross it, yet society is trained to think of those already across as a separate category. For Solzhenitsyn, this is why Gulag cannot be dismissed as a hidden institution, affecting only its direct victims. The habits required to maintain it reshape the mainland. A society that needs millions of people not to ask where their neighbors went must cultivate fear and moral evasiveness on a national scale. The barbed wire encloses prisoners physically, but the same political system muzzles the people outside. Solzhenitsyn's picture of muzzled freedom also explains why people outside the camps could remain genuinely surprised when repression finally reached them. The system fragments knowledge. A person may know that one colleague was arrested, but accept the official explanation, know that a relative disappeared but assume the case was unusual, hear rumors of camps while imagining they contain people unlike himself. Open comparison would reveal a pattern, but open comparison is itself dangerous. Secrecy, therefore, does not require that nobody know anything. It requires that millions know separate pieces without being able to assemble them publicly. This fragmentation produces a peculiar mixture of knowledge and denial. Soviet citizens can understand prison slang, fear the night knock, avoid the family of an arrested person, and still tell themselves that mass arbitrary repression is somehow not a central fact of national life. The archipelago becomes simultaneously familiar and officially unreal. Solzhenitsyn's literary method reverses that condition by assembling individual pieces into a connected map. Chapter 4. Several individual stories. Volume 2 closes by returning from systems and categories to individual lives. Solzhenitsyn has described millions of people through waves, camps, brigades, and institutions, but he knows that statistical scale can flatten the very human reality he wants to preserve. A few biographies, therefore, stand as reminders that every prisoner passed through the archipelago as a unique person with convictions, weaknesses, accidents, relationships, and choices. The longest story is that of Anna Petrovna Skripnikova. Born into a worker's family and intellectually gifted, she passed through the revolutionary era with strong political and moral convictions of her own. She was not naturally submissive. Early in Soviet power, she confronted officials whose violence she considered intolerable, including a local security chief, whom she denounced openly for representing a politics of burial and banditry. Such directness repeatedly brought her into conflict with authority. Skripnikova's life becomes a succession of arrests, prisons, exiles, releases, renewed arrests, and petitions. The repeated punishment does not produce the quiet survival strategy the system expects. Instead, she continues writing complaints and appeals, insisting on the distinction between state power and justice. Her personality makes her difficult to intimidate because humiliation itself seems to strengthen her determination to name what is happening. Even after Stalin's death, she refuses the comforting explanation that responsibility belonged only to one dead dictator or a small circle of executed officials. During later re-examination of her cases, she confronts an investigator who says that he merely carried out the policy of the time and had believed Stalin. Skripnikova rejects the defense. Someone, she insists, must answer for particular acts committed against particular people. Historical responsibility cannot disappear simply because policy has changed. Her persistence continues after her own situation improves. She writes on behalf of prisoners and exiles she met during later terms, seeks rehabilitation of others, and pressures local authorities through letters sent to Moscow. Solzhenitsyn admires the implacability. If a much larger proportion of citizens had possessed even part of her refusal to accommodate injustice, he suggests, Russian history would have been different. The second major biography, Stepan Vasilievich Loschelin, is almost the opposite in temperament. Born in 1908 to a worker's family, orphaned during famine, and drawn into Komsomol and party life, he is not a heroic dissident. As a young man, he even participated in dekulakization. He wants education, skilled work, and an ordinary place inside Soviet society. His life, nevertheless, becomes entangled repeatedly with bureaucratic punishment. A small workplace dispute, loss of party dues, unemployment, and administrative decisions begin pushing him downward. At a Moscow railway station in 1937, a security employee simply directs him into an office. He obeys. He is detained, searched, moved through overcrowded cells, robbed, and eventually transported without a conventional trial. Only later does he discover the category assigned to him, socially harmful element, 4 years. His bewilderment is characteristic. His father was a worker. He himself is a worker. He has served the new order. Why is he socially harmful? The classification needs no coherent answer. He is sent into logging and labor, suffers injury, returns to work, and eventually completes the term. At release, he is even charged for missing camp clothing that had been stolen, so the institution plunders him on departure as it had on entry. War and labor legislation continue to shape his fate. The life of a person never charged with grand political conspiracy can still be repeatedly captured by administrative categories, work discipline rules, and institutions operating at the boundary between employment and punishment. Yet Solzhenitsyn remains inwardly attached to the Bolshevik project. His story complicates any simple map in which those harmed by Soviet power necessarily become its ideological enemies. Solzhenitsyn then gestures toward biographies he cannot fully include. Among them is Father Pavel Florensky, the priest, philosopher, and scientist whose intellectual gifts did not protect him from arrest and northern imprisonment. Other political, technical, and administrative figures appear only briefly. The omissions themselves become part of the argument. No writer possesses enough years, documents, or testimony to restore every life consumed by the archipelago. The volume ends with Solzhenitsyn reflecting on the decades he has spent in relation to this hidden country, first as prisoner, then exile, then investigator and writer. The archipelago has become not simply a historical subject, but the framework through which he understands the moral structure of his society. The individual stories provide the final corrective to abstraction. Gulag was built through decrees, economic plans, security departments, work norms, legal articles, and transport systems. But none of those things suffered. People suffered. One person resisted from the beginning, another remained loyal, another informed, another guarded, another escaped, another broke, another discovered faith, another simply tried to survive. The system is comprehensible only when its immense scale and these irreducibly individual lives are held together. Skripnikova and Solzhenitsyn also illustrate two very different forms of endurance. Skripnikova makes resistance part of her identity and repeatedly challenges officials, even when challenge brings renewed punishment. Solzhenitsyn adapts, obeys, works, and continues to interpret himself through the Soviet social order that repeatedly injures him. Solzhenitsyn includes both because historical suffering does not produce one standardized political consciousness. The same institutions can create an implacable critic and a bewildered loyalist. Their stories return the reader to the moral principle of Part 4. External classification tells us little about the whole person. A worker can participate in dekulakization and later become an administrative victim. A dissident can be stubborn, exhausting, and morally courageous at the same time. The task of testimony is not to flatten these lives into exemplary heroes and villains, but to recover enough detail that the categories imposed by the state no longer have the final word. Volume 2, therefore, ends without resolving the tension between ascent and corruption. Solzhenitsyn has deliberately shown both. Camp conditions can reduce human beings to hunger, fear, envy, and dependence. They can also create moments in which a person sees his previous life with an honesty that comfort never demanded. Neither outcome belongs automatically to suffering. The institution deserves condemnation because it deliberately multiplies conditions of degradation. Any moral insight wrested from those conditions is the prisoner's achievement, not the camp's. The same principle applies to Soviet society outside the wire. Citizens face pressures that are less concentrated but structurally related. Conformity is rewarded, information is fragmented, denunciation can be useful, and fear makes solidarity costly. The moral question is therefore not confined to people who wear prisoner numbers. It reaches everyone asked to participate, remain silent, look away, or preserve another person's humanity. By closing with individual biographies, Solzhenitsyn leaves that question at the level where he believes it ultimately has to be answered, in particular lives and particular choices.